What is the Bible and Beer Consortium? The name itself is actually a linear explanation of the event. First, a topic is given from a biblical perspective. These topics are pertinent to what is being discussed in everyday life. The BBC attempts to present strong answers to life's greater ontological questions. Second, this lecture or sermon is given in a pub.
Can we get to something that provides a certain foundation where there are no more whys? In Christianity, we would teach that God is the ground of things like goodness and truth and beauty.
And then finally, the lecture is further explained or defended in an open mic Q&A.
You said that it seems that your main argument against Christianity is the excessive suffering in the world, correct?
The Bible and Beer Consortium, to present the truth of God as it is to people as they are.
Musical sponsor for this episode of the Bible and Beer Consortium is Grady Spencer and the Work.
Well ran dry, cedar whiskey ran cold. He put down his plow for 44. Sun would come up, said his hair would go back to sleep. Said I've never had a plan for a better life. I just killed a man for his better night. Try as I may, try as I might, I'll never make it out alive. So lay it down low, so swing it on, sweet yard. Could you come and take me to the streets paved with gold? People gonna know my name. Girl looked done gone by the time it woke. Whiskey in his eyes and his hair full of smoke. I wish someday she'd stay around. Good.
Tonight's speakers. Blake Giunta is the founder of BeliefMat.org, an interactive online encyclopedia which aims to provide users with academically respected points and counterpoints in the debate over God's existence, as well as the debate over Jesus' resurrection. He has 10 years of experience researching and writing on these subjects, as well as regular interaction with a variety of non-believers. He is co-director of the Reasonable Faith Group at the University of Texas at Dallas, and has appeared on a number of atheist talk radio shows and podcasts, including Dogma Debate, Atheistically Speaking, where he enjoys having cordial discussions on these important issues. Tonight, speaking to the topic, Does God Exist? Please welcome Blake Giunta.
Well, good evening. I want to begin by thanking the Bible and Beer Consortium for inviting me to participate in tonight's debate. It's really a special privilege to be having this discussion with you all, and especially with Matt Dillahunty. I know a lot of you have grown up listening to Matt, and if you're like me, you probably, that wasn't meant to be like that. If you're like me, you've grown to appreciate, in particular, sort of Matt's carefulness that he brings to sort of these conversations. He's very skeptical, but at the same time, it's a careful kind of skepticism that I appreciate and that I think can be emulated. That said, I want to make a careful presentation, a careful case for God's existence, and in order to establish that God probably exists. Now, that word probably there is denoting a measure of confidence, and this is a very what we call Bayesian way of talking. And correspondingly, this is a form of Bayes' theorem. And what it says is that your confidence, what you say is probable, should depend on two issues, which I'm going to focus on tonight. In the case of theism, one, what is the intrinsic probability of the hypothesis that God exists prior to looking at any evidence? And two, look at the evidence. How well does it fare in comparison to its competitor? On that first question, theorists have largely associated the intrinsic probability of an hypothesis with its simplicity and modesty. And I want to suggest that the God hypothesis is very modest because one can use pure reason to confirm so much of it before seeing any evidence at all. So, for example, I understand God to be very simply the greatest possible being. Theists often say this implies that if God exists, God is necessary. He is so great that God could not be gone from reality. If I can show you by reason alone that an entity exists in this way, then it seems like theism would get an intrinsic boost, or a boost in its intrinsic probability. And that's because it's one less way that the hypothesis could go wrong. And I think I can show you that. First, you have to know that modal logic is a standardized logic. It's taught in every major university, and it's used in many disciplines, including computer science. Second, you just have to know that it's a famously proven theorem in standard modal logic that if something is possibly necessary, then it's actually necessary. So if a necessary entity is possible in this logical metaphysical sense, then per this theorem, it actually exists. In fact, it has to exist. And if that sounds weird at first, you're not alone. This is, and this might help. So consider like a mathematical truth. I apologize, I have to see if I can scroll this down. Yeah, so consider a mathematical truth like 6 cubed equals 216. If that's possibly necessary, then we would say it's actually necessary. And if it's possibly false, then it's necessarily false. That may or may not help you, but just know that the big debate today is over whether a necessary being is genuinely possible. And one argument of many, published recently in support of this possibility, comes from philosopher Josh Rasmussen. And it inspired a much simpler argument published by John Turi a year later. So here it is. Premise 1, it is possible that the first contingent thing is caused to exist. Contingent things are non-necessary things. So ask yourself if this scenario I'm about to show you is like a square circle or not. 1, a causal chain of contingent things. 2, it has a first or a beginning. And 3, that beginning is caused. If you agree that that's not an impossibility, like a square circle, then look at what is suddenly also not impossible. The cause of the first contingent thing can't itself be contingent. So, premise 2. In the possible case where the first contingent thing is caused to exist, a causally powerful necessary thing must cause it to exist. Therefore, a causally necessary thing possibly exists. It's as possible as that arrow. And this is big news because of that theorem that says any necessary thing that's genuinely possible necessarily exists. Atheists have long tried to say that we can't show a necessary thing is possible, but here we seem to do just that. If you want premises for Q&A or you want to see one proof for that theorem, you can get them on this page at beliefmap.org under God exists and then some necessary being exists. So we're talking about hypothesis modesty, and I want us to remember that our most elegant cosmology by far suggests the Big Bang was our first contingent event. And this seems certainly possible, and if it's possible, this certainly seems possible, and this necessary entity is the perfect candidate for its cause. Regardless whether the Big Bang is the beginning or not, notice how modest the God hypothesis becomes in light of Turi's argument. 1, we have a necessary entity. 2, it can possibly cause things to exist. 3, since it's necessary, it can exist without space. 4, without time. And 5, without matter. And I think this is sounding suspiciously like God. Also, ask yourself, how could a necessary entity or event causally give rise to a non-necessary event? If all the conditions sufficient for causation are necessarily there, then how can the effect not also be necessarily there? Here's the solution. If the causation is non-necessitating, non-deterministic, and this is precisely the kind of causation that occurs when one freely chooses between alternatives. So that's number 6. But notice that free will is something had by persons. In asking about fundamental reality then, should we be that surprised if it's personal rather than impersonal? Consider this. Scientific explanations come in the form of laws acting on initial conditions. But that's precisely why science can never explain the nature nor existence of the fundamental laws and initial conditions themselves. I hope you see that. If those have an explanation, it has to be a non-scientific explanation. Well, why not a personal explanation? This would be an explanation in terms of an agent choosing to act on the basis of reasons. I think we're pretty much there, so why not? Why not take up that foundation for your reality? Well, what about this objection? Torrey's argument said that there's a necessary being, but the thing could be a collection of some kind. It would just be more complex. For example, why can't the atheist or naturalist just say the universe is necessary? 4 reasons. First, such a solution is ad hoc. This is being posited so atheism can keep up pace with theism, and not for independent reasons like what the theist had. Second, and relatedly, there are no arguments for the universe as being necessary, and it's unlikely that there will be. The universe on the standard model is composed of space, time, and 17 fundamental particles, each with a loaded set of parameters and rules, and an argument that this specific set of particles, one after the other, with each of their specific properties, one after the other, the idea that each of these things would be necessary seems pretty wild on the face of it. I occasionally hear someone say that maybe it's all explained by a fundamental equation. But in addition to being highly implausible, equations are abstract objects, like the number 7, and it's widely accepted that such entities do not stand in causal relations. Third, there are several papers published recently on the role of conceivability in discerning what is genuinely possible. It's generally believed that conceivability is a guide to discerning genuine possibility. And this is relevant because what the universe is determined by what it is fundamentally composed of. This in turn is relevant because physicists can conceive of a different fundamental set of physical particles with different interactions. So we have prima facie reason to think that the universe is not necessary. Fourth, this is also extremely complex compared to theism. To show you how simple theism is, I want to compare God to a single electron. Remember that on theism, God is something like an unembodied mind, if not precisely that. Notice first then, you can't name the parts of the mind because it has no parts. It's more like an electron. Remember that electrons are leptons, and like all the fundamental particles in the standard model, it's commonly understood to have no substructure. That's simple. Second, like a single fundamental particle, what a limitless mind does is so simple that it's not mediated by deeper mechanisms. This is not magic. It's just that, like the electron, it has an irreducible causal power. Consider the electron's a negative charge, whereby it just repels other electrons. Similarly, a mind just produces thoughts. They may be very complex, but the unembodied mind by itself is not. Third, the mind has only 2 or 3 interesting properties that ground the others, notably power and knowledge. Moreover, fourth, as many analytic philosophers have noted, God even holds these in the simplest possible way, with 0 limitations added to them. So God has a lot in common with a single electron, but is even simpler. The atheist has to believe something better explains the contingent world, even if he doesn't know what it is. And I find it unlikely that his best hypothesis will be as elegant and modest as the God hypothesis. This should give us, I think, a decently high intrinsic probability for God, far more than for the extremely complex flying spaghetti monster. Let us turn now to the evidence. This second factor, I need to preface this section by saying I'm going to be presenting a lot of material, way more than Matt can address in a cross-exam. So do not think that just because Matt doesn't challenge me on something, that means he doesn't have a response to it. Okay, so my main evidence tonight is the existence of a moral arena. This is not the moral argument. In fact, you don't have to believe objective right and wrong exist at all. I know many of you don't, or a lot of the atheists don't, I know. Rather, a moral arena is simply a community of persons, not necessarily humans, but persons in circumstances where they can engage in what we at least call moral decision-making, where they can interact and mold themselves in what gets called morally significant ways. So I'm saying this is evidence for theism, and to define evidence, I'm using the standard likelihood principle. It says that our being in a moral arena is evidence for theism over atheism, just in case the probability, if you'll watch the slides, of a moral arena on the assumption of theism is greater than the probability of a moral arena on the assumption of atheism. This is like saying that John's fingerprints being on the murder weapon is evidence for John's being the murderer. Why? Because the probability of that observation is higher on the guilt hypothesis than on the innocence hypothesis. For our calculation, then, we first need to ask, how much does the hypothesis of atheism in and of itself lead one to expect a moral arena? We'll consider that an all-good God is not unlikely to bring about great or the greatest goods. And whether in fiction or reality, the greatest goods require a community of embodied moral agents. It's being embodies that really amplifies our abilities to express virtues like love, to engage virtuously in cooperative endeavors, and to make a difference, and to mold our character in morally significant ways. Because these are so clearly great or the greatest goods, most will put the likelihood of a moral arena, given theism, somewhere between 10 and 90%. That's the kind of situation an all-good God would plausibly bring about. I'm going to be conservative, though, and put it at 1%. But the nice thing about this calculation is you get to pick your own number. If you've got a smartphone or something that you can write down on, I encourage you to join in. You're going to write down 9 numbers total reflecting your position as we go. So write down your blue number first, and now we need to think about this green number, the likelihood of a moral arena on atheism. You could just guess, but this probability is fairly complex. Your estimate's going to be more informed if you break it up. For example, to get a moral arena on atheism, you need a universe. So you can figure that likelihood out, and from there, the likelihood that it would be life permitting, which you also need. All the way up until you get to a moral arena. The math whizzes here know that this only works given the following assumption. If you get a moral arena on the hypothesis of atheism, this is the way it happens, which I think it is. At the end, you'll multiply these together to get your answer, and I'm going to give you my numbers as we go for an example. Starting at the top, on the assumption that God does not exist, there seem to be no arguments that space, matter, or physics would exist. I should say that they would exist. It seems that a perfectly rational atheist who sees no evidence for a universe would reject belief in all that stuff. It's very weird. So think of like an ingenious atheist who's never had sense perceptions. For him, matter, physics, and space would seem more improbable than any spaghetti monster seems to you. So I think the likelihood of a universe existing on atheism by itself is virtually nil. It's entirely unpredicted. From there, how likely is it that there would be a life-permitting universe in particular? Well, Brumfield says, quote, if you believe the equations of the world's leading cosmologists, the probability that the universe would turn out this way, life permitting, by chance are infinitesimal. Luke Barnes recently published a review of the scientific literature, 200 plus papers, and says that he can only think of, quote, a handful of physicists that oppose this conclusion and piles that support it. Here he lists some of the widely recognized constants that require fine-tuning for life. For example, the cosmological constant is fine-tuned to 1 part in 10 to the 120th power. And if you get it wrong, the universe either expands so rapidly that you only ever get the 2 lightest elements, or it collapses within picoseconds of the Big Bang. And notice, in such circumstances, no life of any kind could evolve. In hopes of escaping this problem, some atheists are seeking a successful multiverse model with enough variation. 5 quick problems, though. 1, infinite multiverse models face, among other things, the measure problem, where suddenly no events can be called rare or less common. So, for example, you can't say it's unlikely that you will spontaneously combust in 5 seconds, because that's just as common in the multiverse as you're not combusting. 2, a lot of the most popular multiverse models face the Boltzmann-Brains problem, which is this. It's a nasty consequence that you're probably just a brain with no body that's fluctuating into existence right now, with the mistaken belief that you've had a rich history and that you're at a debate. And this is because the likelihood of such a thing fluctuating into existence is far higher than that of a universe with the relevant low entropy condition. 3, the models and model kinds face unique problems at the physics level, often harboring inconsistencies and often requiring especially wild and speculative mechanisms. 4, they aren't designed to go after instances of fine-tuning. And 5, the relevant versions also seem to require some fine-tuning themselves, both new tunings and occasionally pushing the tuning that they wanted to rid themselves of into a new area, like the proverbial wreck in the carpet. So I'm doing my calculation without paying mind to the multiverse idea. That means the likelihood of a life-permitting universe remains incomprehensibly low for me. But I will massively highball it and just say it's less than 0.1%. Next, given there is a life-permitting universe, how much should you expect that life would actually arise in it? Well, if the situation on our planet's any indicator, you shouldn't think it's very likely. On their 125th anniversary, Science magazine published a top 25 and top 125 problems in science based on extensive academic polling. In polls like this, the origin of life problem is always center stage. Klaus Doss echoes the widespread sentiment of origin of life researchers, writing, quote, "More than 30 years of experimentation on the origin of life in the fields of chemical and molecular evolution have led to a better perception of the immensity of the problem of the origin of life on Earth rather than to its solution. At present, all discussions on principal theories and experiments in the field either end in stalemate or in a confession of ignorance." So without God, I have more to read here. Now, you might hear of the RNA world hypothesis in school, but that doesn't even attempt to solve half the problems. And for the problems it does go after, it still runs into huge issues. Carl Woese, the originator of the RNA world hypothesis, confessed, in one sense, the origin of life problem today remains what it was in the time of Darwin, one of the great unsolved riddles of science. He adds, while we do not have a solution, we now have an inkling of the magnitude of the problem. So without God, I think a life-permitting universe predicts life about as much as a cell phone-permitting universe permits cell phones. It's not anywhere near as high as 10% expected for me, but I'm going to put it at 10% anyways. Next, given there is an origin of life, how likely is it that complex brains, or something that functions like them at least, would evolve in the universe? Well, you might have noticed another of the top 25 questions just below. What determines species diversity? Or better, what drives evolution? Notice they aren't questioning common descent. The question is largely about neo-Darwinism, the modern synthesis. And this is the standard view that we were all taught in school, that natural selection acting on random genetic variations is what explains all the diversity of life. So that same process, which explains how pre-existing designs can get optimized for a situation, can over time produce all this complex engineering and ultimately produce brains of some kind. However, the sufficiency of the modern synthesis is very controversial today. Eugene Koonin is one of the most renowned living evolutionary biologists, and on the recent 150th anniversary of Darwin's Origin of Species, Koonin's entry in a top journal was the introductory piece. The journal is Trends in Genetics, and the piece was a synopsis of where the field of evolutionary biology is today. Koonin writes, quote, "The summary of this state of affairs on the 150th anniversary of the origin is somewhat shocking. In the post-genomic era, all major tenets of the modern synthesis are, if not outright overturned, replaced by a new and incomparably more complex vision of the key aspects of evolution. So, not to mince words, the modern synthesis is gone." As noted in this paper, how evolutionary adaptations and innovations originate is one of the most profound questions in evolutionary biology. Let me recommend 3 papers quickly. I chose 3 that are free online. This one, Biological Theory, Postmodern Evolution, is on 16 very high-profile researchers who are thinking about alternatives. This one, The Fate of Darwinism, Evolution After the Modern Synthesis, covers a history of this overturn. And this paper hosts an easy-to-read debate. Does evolutionary theory need a rethink? Where both sides agree that evolutionary theory is true, but is radically different than what it was just a decade ago. They agree that there is a raging debate over which mechanisms are sufficient or will appear in the final theory, and whether they can still honestly call it the modern synthesis. Here's how this relates to my argument. If I were an atheist, I would look around, see that there's all this evolved life, and conclude that it is a fact that some non-God mechanism did it. That's a big part of the reason the first version of the modern synthesis was called a fact. For this calculation, though, the factness has to come in a way that you could present, again, to a maximally rational version of yourself watching first life form 4 billion years ago. And you can't tell him the future. That's analogous to question begging. You can only reason with him about what might happen and why. With the death of neo-Darwinism, though, I think you would completely fail to convince this rational version of yourself. So I can't bring myself to put this higher than 1%. Next, given that brains do evolve, what's the likelihood that there would be consciousness? Notice that nothing in known physics would allow someone to look at the brain and conclude, hey, there's someone in there. This thing has first-person experiences. So you can't predict consciousness that way. You might think, well, only brains with subjective experiences would avoid pain and try to survive. So we can predict that consciousness would evolve because it's adaptive. This also is wrong. Only people who believe in souls think that the mind can affect the brain like that. Almost all atheists say your body would do what it does even if no mental life existed, because the brain is a physically closed machine. All your neurons would fire just the same without you and move your body the same adaptive way. Evolutionary history would be identical with or without consciousness. So, simply given that brains evolve without God, I'd no more expect them to be conscious than I would the internet to be conscious, or stars, or an electron. So for me, this is less than 1%. Next, what's the likelihood that any of these conscious blobs of matter would have beliefs? Consciousness doesn't imply beliefs, and again, looking at the conscious brain, no known physics would lead atheists to predict such an obscure thing. As usual, at best, he can be entirely surprised and learn it after the fact. So it's again less than 1% for me. Then on atheism, we need to know why, just because beliefs exist, that an atheist would expect these very particular kinds of beliefs to exist. Beliefs about right and wrong. Even if these were adaptive, naturalists say our concept of morality depends on an unknown, highly contingent evolutionary history that, like humanity itself, easily might never have evolved, even in a universe full of alien life. But then why expect it to occur even once? I'm going to be super charitable here and put this at 50% for me. I'll also be charitable and assume that these are the only things atheism needs for a moral arena. Now we can multiply these numbers together, which again I felt were often charitable, and here you can see my personal calculation for how expected a moral arena is on atheism. Then you plug it in here, and as long as your blue number is greater than the green, the moral arena for you is evidence for theism over atheism. In my case, you can see it's very powerful evidence. Notice, this is not a God of the gaps argument. And that's because things like wave-particle duality or the other top 25 mysteries in science are equally unexpected on atheism. Those are not evidence for God. This stuff I'm showing here is evidence. If I had time, I'd present several additional evidences for theism, including evidences from objective morality and more. Still, I think things are looking pretty good for theism so far, both in terms of its intrinsic probability, where we saw from reason alone that a being like this has to exist anyways, and its explanatory power. In the absence of comparable counter-evidence, I think we can be very justified in believing that God exists.
Time after the time before, then I see the words you know, they're written in a concrete floor. So it's gonna be. And looking in.
Our second speaker tonight is Matt Dillahunty. Matt is an American public speaker, avid gamer, bright fashion spokesperson, magician and internet personality, and was the president of the atheist community of Austin from 2006 to 2013. He's hosted the Austin-based webcast and cable access television show The Atheist Experience since 2005, and formerly hosted the internet radio show Nonprofits Radio. A Southern Baptist more than 25 years, he sought to become a minister until his investigation of his religious views led him to reject supernatural claims. He now identifies as a skeptic, humanist, and atheist. He is a founder and contributor of the counter-apologetics encyclopedia Iron Chariots, as well as the Atheist Debates Patreon project, which are dedicated to providing the understanding of tools for more effective discussions between theists and atheists. He is regularly engaged in formal debates and travels the world speaking to secular organizations, churches, and university groups on religion, philosophy, skepticism, atheism, humanism, and magic. He's married to Beth Presswood, a microbiologist and winner of the Austin Chronicle's listener-selected Best Podcast, Godless Bitches. They live in Austin, Texas with their 4 cats, 2 snakes, and the occasional scorpion. Speaking to the topic, Does God Exist? Please welcome Matt Dillahunty.
All right, thanks. Did I write that introduction or did somebody else? Because that took forever. I'm busy. I'm a busy guy.
Go ahead.
I'm really happy to be here at the Bible and Beer Consortium, even though I'm not much of a beer guy. So if it was the Bible and Tequila Consortium, which I saw some afterwards, I'd rather not debate drunk. Maybe we can have like the absinthe section for like the French philosophers. I don't know. I didn't know much about Blake before I got the introduction, was told who I was going to be debating. I try not to tailor my talk to who I'm engaging, instead preparing for arguments. But I did listen to a little bit, and right away he reminded me of John Ferrer, who I've debated a couple times and will debate again. I like them both. I don't look at these things as WWE events like some other people do. I really want to have conversations despite what you may have seen on TV or with Cy. So we may not have the same vocabulary. There's an echo, yep. We may not have the same vocabulary. We may end up debating terminology at some point. I don't mind semantic discussions. They're about meaning, which is important. But in this format, I hope we can avoid tangents which delve into labels, because we disagree on the atheist label for sure. Something we'll get into some other day, I'm sure. And focus on the task at hand, does God exist? When I was a kid, I enjoyed Ripley's Believe It or Not. And it was a show that purported to demonstrate amazing facts and feats that, while seemingly unbelievable or extraordinary at face value, were actually real, or at least most of them were. I was a Bible-believing Southern Baptist Christian, and it was very clear to me that what you believe is a separate issue from what's actually true. God either exists or does not exist, irrespective of whether you believe he exists, believe he doesn't exist, or reject both. For any given claim, and note that I'm talking about a claim here, not a question, there are only 2 possibilities. Either you believe the claim or you do not believe the claim. If you do not believe the claim, in other words, you reject it, that doesn't mean that you accept the contradictory claim. By way of example, if there were a jar of gumballs here, one might ask, is the number of gumballs odd or even? After all, we know that it must be one or the other. And about that question, you might have a number of different positions. You could believe that it's odd, you could believe that it's even, you could reject neither, or either. But when you consider the statement, the number of gumballs is odd, you either believe that or you don't. There's no middle ground. Believe and not believe are direct logical negations, and to propose a middle ground on that single claim would be to violate the foundations of reason. This is where we get into confusing language about how we talk about these things, because we're thinking about a question when we really need to be addressing a statement. The default position should be to reject or disbelieve all claims until such time as there's sufficient reason to accept them, which could be really easy for some claims. For something like gumballs, we don't default to it's odd until you prove it's even, or it's even until you prove it's odd, because we recognize that those are equally likely and that they're both properly testable and falsifiable, and that the impact of being wrong is negligible. But when it comes to things like trials in a court of law, in the United States, we have a presumption of innocence until guilt is proven. There's a burden of proof set on the prosecution. They're raising a claim the defendant is guilty, and as a member of a jury, you either render a verdict of guilty or not guilty. And a verdict of not guilty isn't a declaration of innocence, and it doesn't say anything at all about what you're actually convinced of. It just says what you're not convinced of. You may be convinced the defendant's actually innocent, or you may just not have been convinced of guilt. You might even be convinced that he probably did it, but the evidence wasn't sufficient for you to render a verdict beyond a reasonable doubt or to a reasonable certainty or whatever the standard is for that trial. So for clarity, I find God not guilty of existing. The claim some God exists has, to my mind, not met its burden of proof. Whether or not I also find God innocent of the charge of existing is secondary and irrelevant to whether or not his guilt has been established. It seems to frustrate some people when I defend what Blake and others might call the non-theistic position rather than defending the proposition that God, in fact, does not exist. But that's not my problem. We'd think it preposterous to walk into a courtroom with one side trying to prove guilt, the other trying to prove innocence. What if neither of them succeed? Where are we then? What do we do with this person who's been accused? We don't know, and that's why we have burdens of proof. We have default positions for other reasons, because for any claim to be of use, it must be falsifiable, meaning that there must be some observation which would demonstrate that the claim is false. We address claims and not questions for those reasons and many more, because it gets very messy. There's a reason that syllogisms don't contain questions, they contain statements. And when we move away from that, we muddy the playing field. All that said, I do believe the answer to the question, does God exist, is no. And I'll explain why, but the important point is that the time to believe any claim, including God exists or God doesn't exist, is after it's met its burden of proof. And a failure to demonstrate that the answer is no doesn't mean that you're justified in thinking it's reasonable to believe that the answer is yes. When I debated Cy ten Bruggencate, the first premise of his argument was, it is reasonable to believe that which is true. And I failed to point out that while the premise is very tempting, it's actually false. It flew right by me, it flew by most of the people in the room, it's false. And he said, I don't think Matt will challenge that because that's just the definition of reasonableness. He completely buffaloed me. I addressed it later on. The fact that something is true is separate from whether or not you have good reason to think it's true. It may be true that aliens are right now en route to the Earth to take over the planet, but I don't have sufficient reason to think that's the case, and so I cannot reasonably believe it, even if it happens to be true. And it's worth noting that it may also be reasonable to believe something that is in fact false. This is the realm where magicians and con men prey by selling you something that's false, by making it appear to be reasonable based on insufficient information. So first, the reasons I do not believe that a God exists. Simply this: I don't think the claim has been established and met its burden of proof. There are a host of classical arguments for the existence of God, and they've been considered, rejected, reformed, rejected, dusted off, and polished up, and rejected for as long as we've been attempting to reasonably evaluate this claim that a God exists. There are very few truly new arguments, if any, and all of them are examples of trying to fit the argument and evidence to the conclusion one prefers, rather than following the evidence where it leads or acknowledging that we simply do not have sufficient information to reach a particular conclusion. Some of them are arguments that the observations about the world necessarily mean that a God exists. Others are arguments that the world probably points to a God. I'm not sure how one can calculate the probability of something that you can't investigate and for which you have no concrete examples. If you're trying to do a Bayesian analysis, you'll end up with a zero in either the numerator or the denominator somewhere, and that's a big mistake. Still others aren't arguments for the existence of God, but are arguments for belief that a God exists, irrespective of whether one actually does, and they rely on fallacious appeals to consequences. Things like, if there is no God, then we have no absolute grounding for morality, which isn't necessarily true, but if it were true, then what's the reason for concluding that there is a God instead of concluding that we don't have an absolute grounding for reality? Or for morality? There's a core problem that often gets overlooked, and as far as I can tell, there's been no demonstration of any mechanism that would allow us to confirm the existence of anything supernatural. And if you can't do that, without that mechanism, speculations about the nature of the supernatural, the possibility of the supernatural, the probability of the supernatural, whether or not it can interact with reality or manifest in reality, are equally equivalent, or roughly equivalent, to flights of fancy. Without that mechanism, claims that the supernatural has in fact interacted with reality are simply unfounded assertions. They may be correct, but we have no rational grounds on which to determine that. The appeals to the supernatural are untestable and unfalsifiable. It's as if the prosecutions walked in and claimed the defendant stole the diamonds by teleporting into the vault without even attempting to establish that teleportation is possible or that it was the means used by this defendant in this instance. I'm not claiming that there's no supernatural realm. I'm just pointing out what has been recognized for centuries. We have no mechanism to confirm that the supernatural exists or can interact with reality. This is something that Blake alluded to when he talked about science can't solve this problem, it seems. And this is why science rests on the foundation of methodological naturalism and why courtrooms disallow spectral evidence. If someone came to you and claimed that they discovered some important truth and they could offer no mechanism by which the truth could be independently verified, would you believe them? Should you believe them? I don't think you should, and indeed I cannot. This is the position we're in with God's and other supernatural claims. I cannot believe them because they have not met their burden of proof and they don't seem to be able to do so. My friend Aaron says that creationist claims fall into two categories, not evidently true and evidently not true. I don't believe God exists because the claim is not evidently true. But more than just not believing that God exists, I'm further convinced that God does not exist. I'm not asserting this as a claim to absolute certainty, that I've cracked this and scientifically proved that there are no gods. This is just what I think is reasonable. And yes, it does fall prey to the problem that if you can't calculate the probabilities, how did you determine that it's unlikely? That problem still exists in this. I think that the claims, though, at least the God of classical theism and the various subcategories that fall under that, falls into evidently not true. I think the classical theistic God and most, if not all, of the gods that have been proposed throughout history qualify for that label. Not all of the objections that I'll list apply to all of the God claims, but all of them apply to some God claim. A God that exists outside of space and time seems to be not true by definition, as existence is temporal and spatial. If something exists for 0 seconds and occupies 0 space, what does it mean to say that it exists? The normal explanation is that the word exist being used here is kind of a placeholder for whatever exist would mean outside of space and time, and doesn't actually mean exist in the sense that we use it in reality. Okay, then use a different word and don't say God exists and confuse people. Essentially, God doesn't exist in reality, but he, air quotes, exists outside of reality. That doesn't solve the problem, though, because we have no reason to think that there's any such thing as outside of space and time, or that anything could be there in any meaningful sense. The God of classical theism, one who's omnipresent, omnibenevolent, omniscient, omnipotent, is plagued by countless potential fallacies for each of those terms and for the interactions of those terms, and we don't have to go to the glib rock so big that he can't lift it or burrito so hot he can't eat it to see this. The real philosophical problems with these absolutes, these absolute ultimates, were so weighty that modern theologians have redefined the terms, and you saw them on Blake's sheet, so that omnipotent no longer means omnipotent, it means maximally powerful or possessing all logically possible power. But these are more ill-defined flights of fancy. They are as ad hoc as you can get. Hey, our old definition of omnipotent didn't work, so let's come up with a new one. If you don't have any idea how much power, which is sometimes replaced with capability, is logically possible, have you really improved the situation by saying that something has all the power that it can have? Haven't you just limited God? What if it's not actually possible to be maximally powerful? Or what if the creation of the universe, one of the credits the omnipotent is granted with, doesn't fall within that realm? How do they determine that it's possible for any thinking agent to actually do that? Maybe there's a limit to the maximal possibility of a thinking agent, but what the universe can do, or what the multiverse can do, or what the cosmos can do, falls under a different category. Certainly there's a difference between what I can do and what some of you can do. How do they determine it's possible for any thinking agent to do that? Can this thinking agent make himself cease to exist? Has he done that? How do you know? Once he's done it, can he come back? In the end, it seems like a tautology that God can do whatever God can do. I'm not a big fan of the problem of evil as a response to theism in almost any form. I do, though, find the problem of divine hiddenness to be a compelling reason to believe that there isn't a God, at least not one that cares. Why, if there's a God who cares, isn't this obvious common knowledge? Why is it that the best arguments for his existence are complicated things that only a tiny portion of the population can even comprehend? Why do we have to learn so many dead languages and become veritable experts in many fields in order to have any hope of finding this God? Why, for gods like the biblical God, was it once perfectly acceptable to interact with reality, but not now? Why was the Damascus Road experience good enough for Saul but not the rest of us? Why is he playing favorites? Why require us to believe on claims that can't be properly investigated? Why, if he exists, does he seem to be playing an interminable game of hide-and-go-seek? If you never met your father, but your mom assured you that he was alive and loved you and was coming to see you next weekend, and she told you this every week, and it never happened, and then she told you that you had to really, really want him to come visit you before he'd show up, and that it's your fault that he hasn't shown up, wouldn't you reach a point where you'd have to recognize that continuing to believe her claim was an obvious mistake? People often ask, what would it take to convince me that God exists? And I used to give glib answers, but I have a better one. I don't know. But if there's a God, under the classical definitions, that God should know exactly what it would take to convince me, and has not done so. And the fact that this hasn't happened demonstrates that either this God doesn't exist or doesn't want me to know that he exists yet. Either way, not my problem. Can this maximally powerful being, is he capable of convincing me? Can he communicate in a way that I can comprehend? If so, then why hasn't it happened? And if not, what good is omnipotence if it's limited its ability to communicate with his creation? And if he created me so that I'm too stupid to comprehend or incapable of understanding, isn't that his fault? But it's worse than that, because the invisible and the non-existent are indistinguishable to us. If someone told you they had a friend that existed outside of space and time who wouldn't offer any reasonable demonstration of its existence, I think it would be fair to conclude, tentatively and not as an absolute position, that this being doesn't actually exist, at least not in any meaningful sense. Some apologists might argue that God must stay hidden or it'd infringe on our free will. And depending on your definition of free will, we may or may not have it, so that's another conversation. But the God of the Bible apparently had no problem infringing on free will when he hardened Pharaoh's heart or when he purportedly interacted with people in ways that clearly demonstrated his power, right up to Saul's Damascus Road experience. For those who believe in a Satan, you have here a being who was in God's presence and clearly interacted with God, yet was free to rebel. So hiddenness doesn't seem to infringe on free will, if you accept that there's a Satan. Well, it's a mystery. It's all God's plan. Then it's a stupid plan. I'm not laugh line glib. I don't think that an omniscient being should be more stupid than we are. The Bible is a comedy of this God's ineptness that's so bizarre that when I was in Australia, I did like a one-act, one-man play about this. And what I'm saying here is not meant to be insulting. When it comes to intelligence, there's a seemingly endless pool of facts. There seems to be no end to the facts that you can know. But there does seem to be a limit on the foundations of thought. Telling me that God is just so much smarter than me that the things that he's said to have done that seem stupid to me are actually brilliant doesn't make sense and can't make sense. Even if I'm wrong, this is just the way I have to look at it. Telling me that the acts that are attributed to God that I look at and see as immoral are actually moral because God can see so much farther than I can doesn't solve a problem at all. And if God can't clear this up, I'm stuck. Why create an entire universe with billions of planets and billions of stars that have no discernible effect on us if your focus is us? There doesn't seem to be any good reason for that. And it reminds me of Tim the Enchanter from Monty Python's The Holy Grail, who has so much power that he's just randomly shooting out fireballs. I just can't contain all the power. Let me create more galaxies, more galaxies. And Tracy Harris has described this universe as the rough equivalent of the sort that Wile E. Coyote would come up with. Billions of years of expansion and millions of years of evolution that all led to this intended species, an insignificant blip on the cosmic scale. And it seems that the claim is that some being exists in a way that is totally unreal. How then is its existence distinguishable from its non-existence? And from our perspective, if they're logically identical or logically indistinguishable, then they're equivalent. It might be better to say God isn't real than God doesn't exist. Because God doesn't exist unless we alter the word exist to include things outside of reality, which opens the door to all sorts of other things outside of reality. And some of those things are mutually exclusive, which demonstrates that all the attempts to argue for the existence of God involve some form of special pleading. God is a special type of being that exists in a special way that isn't like any other existy thing that we've ever experienced. Leading the evidence toward a preferred conclusion versus following it where it leads is what we see from apologists, or what I see. Would we as rational beings with a proper understanding of science begin to try to solve mysteries in this universe by appealing to a supernatural realm that we have no way to verify? This is a mistake of our less informed ancestors, and it has poisoned our thinking in all sorts of areas. We're desperate to prove that our ancestors were onto something, that this compulsion to seek out the divine had an actual divine source rather than a mistake in our thinking. We reform arguments and try to massage and construct them so that we can at most say that we were able to construct some sort of argument that seems consistent with the observations and has not yet been shown to be in error. I'm willing to say that our ancestors knew less about the world and knew less about what was reasonable and moral, and that their ill-informed conclusions about the supernatural, including gods, should go the way of their ill-informed conclusions about a flat earth and an earth at the center of the universe and that evil spirits cause disease. There's no good reason to think a God exists and plenty of reasons to think that no God exists. After all, most theists who have chosen a specific God think that all of the other gods don't exist. They don't just disbelieve those other gods, they believe that those other gods do not exist. I'm agreeing with them, all of them.
Matt Dillahunty. We are going now to go to cross-examination.
All right, so I've got 10 minutes to ask you questions. And then you'll have 10 minutes to ask me questions, and then we'll let all the people who are talking through my questions ask questions of their own. Hey! See, I can be passive-aggressive from the stage. All right, so I had some questions. There's really not a rebuttal portion, so maybe we'll work through it through the course of these questions and stuff. I actually just kind of jotted down a couple questions that I was interested in just in general from your view. And this will be an obvious potential trap to begin with. So would you consider it wrong, morally wrong, to drown an infant?
Yeah.
Is there any circumstance in which this would be morally good or even morally neutral to drown an infant?
For me to drown, I don't.
For anyone to drown an infant?
I don't think that it would be morally good. Well, I mean, I think I don't have rights over life, so I don't think I can. But I mean, if you're leading into the question of can God do something like that, I think God has the right to take away life. So
if God drowns an infant, there's nothing immoral about that?
I think God can kill any of us whenever, correct?
I'm not questioning whether or not he can as a matter of power.
No, I meant morally, as in morally, it's morally acceptable.
Okay.
I think God has rights over life.
Because you had made a statement at one point in that atheistically speaking thing that a bad, evil God is impossible. So if you've proven that God is bad, then you've proven that God doesn't exist, at least the traditional God. But if what you're saying is that all the things, and I don't know if it's all the things, but at least this first one that was obvious.
It wouldn't be all the things. So I don't think God could lie, for instance. But I do think God has rights over life.
So in the Bible, when God intentionally deceives people, that's not God lying?
So first off, we want to make sure that the debate stays on the existence of God in general. In response to that question, though, some philosophers want to make a distinction between deception and lying. So I'd have to explore what's going on there.
Well, this is actually about the existence of God, because if you could demonstrate that this was actually an immoral act that God took, then God wouldn't exist according to your statement. So
I just was latching onto the Bible reference. My mind jumps.
Yeah, no.
He's going to the Bible. Okay.
I would love to debate what's actually in the Bible or the Christian God, but if we're going to go on with kind of general classical theist stuff, so how is it not a mistake in using Bayes' theorem so normally when we use Bayes' theorem, when we talk about evaluating priors, we don't just hypothesize something that has no examples. We talk about this particular explanation versus all these others. And in any other scenario where we'd use Bayes' theorem, the proposed explanation is something that is real in the world as a plausible. We're actually trying to compare the possibility or the plausibility of two explanations. So like if the example that I used of a prosecutor saying that he teleported in there. Well, wouldn't it be unfair to try to do a Bayesian analysis of whether or not teleportation was what was the best explanation for this if we have no basis and no priors to show that teleportation is real?
Actually, I think that would go into the priors. I mean, so you have an opinion and evaluation on the likelihood of teleportation occurring. So I mean, we could try to think about it. I mean, you'd want to ask yourself if there's any challenge in physics that would arise in virtue of trying to make one object teleport to another. You'd have to figure out, nothing on Earth, of course, has the power to bring about teleportation. So you'd have to think about the likelihood that if maybe aliens did it or a god did it. But if you think about aliens, and again, what's the likelihood that aliens would want to teleport that particular object? That's going to be very low unless you have an argument. And the likelihood that God would want to teleport an object is going to be very low unless you can give an argument like I did in the moral arena for God's wanting to do such a thing. So that actually does go into the priors.
So what if my prior for your morality on theism was 0?
Of theism is 0? If it's 0, then no evidence can affect it. And you're right, then it's game over. But hopefully, I mean, if you're going to set it to 0, you better have, that would mean you're philosophically certain, like in the kind of certainty that I know I'm here, the Cartesian certainty that God doesn't exist.
So there's a difference, though, between how likely is this on the assumption of theism versus, doesn't that also entail, like you did just the assumption of theism, then when you get to atheism, you go to the universe and all the other things that get you to multiply to a very, very small number. And it seems to me that on theism, we would have to do pretty much the same.
Yes.
And we just started with a number. Where's the demonstration of the likelihood of theism?
So you'll remember that in the opening statement, I pointed out that this is a very complex question precisely because the only way to get a moral arena on theism, and I said, look, this is the math wizards know, this is the big assumption, and I think it is, the only way you can get a moral arena on theism is through a universe and through there being brains and so forth. Brains of any kind. But here's my point, is that when it comes to the God question, you don't have to do something like that. You can immediately look at it. In fact, I will let you put whatever intermediaries you'd like. There's no problem with doing that. I just don't think there's going to be something like that. You can jump immediately from knowing that God is all good to having expectations about what God would do.
Sure, and I have no problem with that. The problem here is actually a little bit different, and that is that even if it means nothing to me to say that X is more likely on theism than on atheism, because that doesn't tell me about not anything at all about whether or not theism is actually true. The fact that something is improbable. So like if I'm dealing cards...
Can I interrupt?
Sure.
So you're saying it doesn't say anything about whether theism is likely to be true. What about, would you say that if a proposition is more likely on hypothesis 1 than hypothesis 2, and we can establish that proposition, would you say that proposition is evidence for hypothesis 1?
What I'm saying is that you could come up with a hypothesis that you could ultimately, in this case, assign a higher likelihood to. Mm-hmm. Because what you're doing, theism, the propositions of theism, is an attempt to explain all of the things that are seemingly unexplainable. So if you construct an explanation, no matter whether or not it's possible or likely...
Sorry, I don't think it's trying to explain all the things that are seemingly unexplainable. So
remember
remember that God of the Gaps slide at the end where I explained...
Where you said it wasn't the God of the Gaps, but that doesn't mean I agree.
Well, let me explain it to you. So if you take those 25 mysteries, those top 25 mysteries in science, and you do the exact same thing, look, how likely is this on theism and how likely is this on atheism, then the likelihood for all of them, except for the 2 that I pointed out, is going to be identical. And if something fits just as well on theism and atheism, then by definition it's not evidence for theism or atheism. It's the same. The whole reason I picked out those specific instances is because they are more likely on theism than atheism.
So first of all, I noticed that on all the slides you had S5 there, which was like taunting me, because if I've said one thing at all about modal logic, it's that I reject S5, as do a lot of other people. There's a lot of people who raise objections to the S5 axiom, which I'm not going to bore you all with. To me, and maybe it's because I don't have the philosophical background of some of the others, this seems like here's a problem that we don't have a solution to. And it's big. So let's propose a solution and then say that on the assumption of this solution, the probability of this expectation is very high.
Sorry, what does this relate this back to S5? What did that have to do with?
This has nothing to do with S5.
Oh, do I get to respond to that?
If you'd like to.
Okay. Just to make sure, do you know what S5 is?
Yes.
Okay, what is it? Because some people have a misunderstanding. What do you think it is?
So S5 is the axiom in modal logic that takes a necessary, if something is probably necessary, then it is necessary.
Sorry, say that again?
I'm not going to get the actual phrasing right. It is the point where you get from if it exists in a possible world, then if it necessarily exists in a possible world, then it necessarily exists.
No. Okay, so a lot of people think it's this is if it's possible that something necessarily exists, then it necessarily exists.
Okay.
Okay, and I understand a lot of that's not what actually S5 is.
So
S5 is possibly A entails necessarily possibly A, and the thing I want to point out is that, so this is a quote from Timothy Williamson, he's an Oxford professor. He says, "Indeed, most metaphysicians accept S5 as the propositional modal logic of modality." This is very standard in modal logic, which is widely accepted and taught in universities.
But there are objections to this idea that we're talking about possibilities and extrapolating from that necessary truths to some extent.
Right,
that
and
would
some
be
of
the
that's
mistake.
right, and some of that's surprising. That's the whole point. That's why the theorem was so important.
Sure. But to me, so if you have a problem, hey, we don't know, we can't investigate beyond the Planck time, so we don't know how the universe started. Hey, what if there's a magical being that can do this? Then on the hypothesis of this magical being, we would expect this. Mm-hmm. And on the hypothesis without this magical being, all of a sudden it becomes very unlikely. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't tell me anything at all about whether or not this magical being actually did it.
What it will tell you is that this piece of data that fits better on the magical being hypothesis, and you can't just say the magical being, you want to say the magical being explains it in some way. So the idea, well, because...
I don't see that it explains it. See, I don't see that God is an explanation for anything. It's an attempt to solve a mystery by appealing to a bigger mystery.
So just by definition of evidence, if a piece of data or observation fits better on one hypothesis than another, then it counts as evidence for that hypothesis. All I have to do is show that this data fits better on theism. It's less surprising on theism than on atheism. Your objection, Matt, I think where you're actually getting hung up is you're picking up on the fact that, look, you can have like a hypothesis that's very ad hoc, that has a very low prior probability, and in that case, no matter what the evidence is, it's not going to salvage a hypothesis that has a sufficiently low prior probability.
Right, I see God as that kind of ad hoc.
And that's why I spent so much time at the beginning of my presentation talking about what the intrinsic probability of the hypothesis of God, because these are the types of considerations you want to bring into question in order to evaluate intrinsic probability.
I still can't see this as anything other than, because this pathway that you walk through as you go through and explain it starts with if something is conceivable, then that leads to it being possible. And from there we go to if it's necessarily possible in some world, then et cetera, on down to this is now the best explanation.
Well, I gave several arguments. There are several points in favor of possibility. Conceivability does not entail possibility. So there are some mathematical theorems.
Oh, because I had it down that you said that
it's
maybe
evidence.
you didn't say entail.
Here's what philosophers say is they say conceivability is evidence of possibility, but there are some propositions.
I disagree.
Okay, well there are some Oh, is that all?
Let's have one more question.
Oh,
I'm going to be nice. I didn't have a microphone.
I don't even...
Give him a good one.
Oh.
So, if we're sitting down at a table and I deal out cards to everybody and you end up with 13 spades, that's really unlikely.
With 13 spades. Okay.
Yeah, like you're familiar with a deck of cards. I should have asked that. I'm a magician. I should ask that question first. So it's really unlikely. And so we sit down to try to figure out, it is in fact on the hypothesis that I cheated, you would expect that, and it would turn out to be more probable that on the hypothesis that I cheated, you would get 13 spades than on the hypothesis that I didn't cheat. Mm-hmm. Have we determined anything about whether or not I actually cheated?
Wait. No, you haven't. No, it's
That's all. That's my entire point.
So, yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, I might have missed that. Did I miss something with that?
No, I just...
Wait, is there? Sorry, just real quick. Are there? This is going to be a little bit embarrassing. Are there 13 spades in your deck?
Yes.
Okay, and you're saying that all 13.
I dealt out the cards. I dealt you 13 cards. You got all 13 spades. Ace.
And that's
13.
evidence that you're cheating, but it's not proof. Is that what the conclusion was?
Yes, it's more likely that I cheated than that it happened.
Yeah, that would be evidence that you cheated.
Yes. But it wouldn't confirm that I cheated.
It wouldn't prove that you cheated, correct?
And it's possible that it could have happened without me cheating.
That's correct.
Cool. That's my entire point.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Blake, you now have 10 minutes.
I brought a spare.
I brought a spare. He is prepared.
I drink lots of tea.
Begin your 10 minutes.
If I don't have to pee during your questions, it'll be a miracle and then you win.
Advantage.
After this, we break, so yeah, you're good. Just 10 minutes.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So naturalism is the view that says that nothing has a supernatural explanation. And I want to know, do you believe that there's any evidence for naturalism over almost naturalism, which is the theistic type of view where 99.99999% of things have natural explanations?
So are you asking me about, so there's a difference between philosophical naturalism and methodological naturalism. Are you asking me about philosophical naturalism?
Philosophical, correct.
Because I don't know that I've identified as a philosophical naturalist. As a matter of fact, I've rejected it many times.
Okay.
Because
So-
I think it takes a step too far in asserting, so philosophical naturalism is the claim that there is no supernatural, there's only the natural. And methodological naturalism says we can't say anything about the supernatural, so we're going to do our science by only appealing to natural things until such time as somebody comes as a mechanism for the supernatural. So I'm a methodological naturalist, not a philosophical naturalist.
I got the impression that you were. So why do you think that we use methodological naturalism?
Because there's no demonstrated mechanism to verify the supernatural.
I don't think that's why we use methodological naturalism. I mean, methodological naturalism historically is something that theists proposed and it had more to do with the delegation of responsibilities in the science. The idea was that, look, we don't want to, in order to determine whether God was responsible for something, you have to take into account both the science and the philosophy.
Yes.
And we did not want to have to make scientists get their doctorates in philosophy. So remember, on theism, 99.999% of explanations out there are naturalistic. God created that kind of world for a reason. And if that's true...
I don't see that as a naturalistic explanation, but to say
Well,
God
look,
created for a reason.
If that's true, then a naturalistic scientific approach to the world is going to be very, very successful. But we don't want our scientists having to get a degree to try to make those higher order decisions about whether God was involved. So sort of the academic machine that we set in place was to delegate responsibilities. We set up scientists to always find the best naturalistic explanation no matter what. They are not even allowed to think about God while they have their lab coat on.
Right.
That's
Now-
okay.
now
But
whether
look, here's the point:
okay.
the reason this is important is because if you try to move from methodological naturalism to trying to say that, look, or to come to any conclusions about truth finding there in that regard, you're doing something that violates what the original intentions were.
Well, first of all, I don't really care what the original intentions were. If their intention were not to trample on God's territory, okay, that may have been how it started. But when you get into the modern era of science, and you've got, Karl Popper and the ideas of falsification, now the justification for why we continue to use methodological naturalism is because it works, and because no one is if somebody could demonstrate.
Sorry to interrupt, but doesn't it work on 99.99999% of theism? So
I don't know.
think of this. So you have methodological naturalism. Here, I'm going to tailor this to you. You have methodological naturalism and methodological almost naturalism. They would both be just as successful. So you can't use the success of science to.
Well, wouldn't that necessarily mean that adding the theism or whatever is almost naturalism didn't actually add a damn thing to anything?
No,
If they're equally valuable, then basically you're saying that the theistic add-in doesn't add anything.
Sorry, I don't understand. You're saying I'm not granting that. I don't grant that everything has a natural explanation. Is that what you're suggesting? That I'm saying?
No, you said methodological naturalism and methodological almost naturalism would have the same success rate.
No, because one of them's 99.9999.
Oh, and the other one's 100.
Oh, okay. You're talking about the success rate of So here's a question. So the best naturalistic explanation, for instance, of the origin of life may be the RNA world. Do you consider that a success? Because
I have no idea.
Okay, because you might say on naturalism that methodologically that's our best explanation. That's it. I mean, if you want to call that a success, you're right. I'm going to say no, that's not a success.
So what I'm saying is that when we come, so science isn't about truth.
Mm-hmm.
It's not making declarations about truth. It's probabilistic in nature. It is telling us, based on the available information, this is the best conclusion that we can reach. And these conclusions don't include appeals to anything other than nature. It's not declaring that the supernatural doesn't exist. The position of science is that, hey, we can't say anything about that until somebody provides a mechanism by which we can, if somebody could show a mechanism by which we could verify the supernatural, all of a sudden that would be within the realm of science.
But so look, it's not truth-seeking, you're right, because there are, in my opening statement, I made a case that you're going to have an explanation for the universe. And if you have an explanation, and the universe just is all the stuff that science works within, an explanation for the laws of nature, okay? If you're going to have an explanation for the laws of nature, it can't be a scientific explanation. It can't be an explanation involving a mechanism. And yeah, you're right. Science is not a question.
You're talking about an explanation for the origin of the laws, not the actual,
the explanation,
like just the observation that these are the laws, this is how it works, because that is science.
Right. An explanation for the origin of laws.
Okay.
All right. So this is actually a
Now,
question
I wouldn't go so far as to say science can't or can't ever, but it doesn't seem that it's possible to explain those things now.
No, I disagree. It's logically impossible because scientific explanations are explanations in terms of initial conditions and laws acting on initial conditions. And so you can't use science to explain the fundamental laws of nature.
To explain the origin of the laws of...
The origin of if you call it, if you want to say the word.
I think there's confusion over one little word, but go ahead.
So this is actually a question I've wanted to ask you for a long time, just in listening to
Because you grew up listening to me.
Yeah. So, it's true. So, I've kind of detected what possibly might be like a kind of a circle of protection that might prevent someone who adopts sort of the strategies that you're taking to fend off supernatural explanations. They might have put themselves in a situation where they can never find out if they're wrong or not. And I noticed a similarity between sort of all the things you say in order to keep supernatural explanations out. They resemble very closely the way some biblical inerrantists prevent allowing in contradictions into their view. So if you try to show someone a contradiction, you might have even encountered theists who do this. And they'll say,
I might even have been one.
Yeah. And you try to show them a contradiction, and they'll say, look, this is just an argument from ignorance fallacy. You're just saying I don't know, therefore it's a contradiction. Or you're saying, because we don't have a known explanation for this contradiction, then there is none. Or they'll say, my standard of evidence is high.
Yeah,
right?
except that I'm not saying.
Or that's a lazy answer. I mean, I like it go one by one. And this is actually when I hear you sometimes now, I think to myself, wait a second. These are all the exact same things that someone who believes in biblical inerrancy would say to protect their worldview. And I guess I wanted to know if you thought that was a problem.
Well, I guess I'd have to have an example, because the way you characterize it doesn't, I mean, it's probably not wholly inaccurate, but I'm not fending off supernatural explanations. Currently, I have no mechanism to demonstrate that I can identify and verify a supernatural explanation. So when somebody offers up a claim that the supernatural is the cause of something, and they offer no reason and no mechanism for me to independently verify that, of course I reject it. I would reject any claim along those lines, apart from the things that we just accept out of practical necessity, like that there's no solution to the problem of hard solipsism or whatever.
Yeah, and so I think some of this might come down
But I'm not asserting that the supernatural isn't real.
Right. And for the
record, also, tomorrow,
today,
you or anybody else could demonstrate a mechanism. I'm not saying that it's impossible for you to demonstrate a mechanism to the supernatural, just that, to my knowledge, it hasn't happened.
So this presupposes that a mechanism is required in order for it to be either possible, or you're saying to rationally accept?
To rationally accept. So this is where I was talking about the difference between what may or may not be true versus what it is reasonable to believe. And I don't think that it's reasonable to believe supernatural claims.
So, sorry to interrupt, we're short on time. It's just that, so this is a very unique way to approach the questions, is you're trying to take...
Thank you.
You're taking methodological naturalism, and you're applying it to philosophy, right?
No, it's skepticism that I'm using. So the position of philosophical skepticism is that the time to believe things is after they've been reasonably established.
Okay, I'm going to ask one last question.
Sure.
So what do you think about the electron when you keep talking about mechanisms? where it seems like right now it's rather common to believe, to my understanding, standard even, that there is no mechanism involved in what the electron does in terms of its charge and repelling other electrons. There is no mechanism.
I have no position on that at all. I have no expertise
In fact, if you
that
think
area.
about it, your fundamental particles can't have deeper mechanisms. And so if you try to take this approach, it's going to destroy science.
So what I would do in that case is I would get a hold of Sean Carroll, who did this great talk at Skepticon 5 about known unknowns and unknown unknowns and how we know what we know about it, because I don't know. I'm not a physicist, and I don't even probably have a fundamental understanding of electrons to be able to assess the question.
Do you see logically how there would have to be, though, your fundamental entities that would have their just fundamental abilities? You can't have an infinite regress of mechanisms. And so this, I don't think this is, I think if you approach questions this way, you're going to leave out true answers.
Last response.
Sure. So, for example, string theory is kind of popular. If you said, do you believe string theory? I'd say no. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't mean I believe it's wrong. I just don't have the relevant understanding of it to accept that it's true. There's all kinds of things that I don't know. Tons of things I don't know. There's all sorts of things that I don't know that any of us know, no matter how much somebody really offers. I'm really convinced that string theory is right or this other one. To me, string theory looks like magic. But that's because I don't understand it, because I haven't bothered to study it, I think. Maybe if I studied it, I'd have a different view. Maybe I wouldn't, but I can't answer about that. As far as the infinite regress, when it comes to particles and functions, yeah, I see your point that I would say that there must be some smallest thing. Whether or not we're there or understand it is a whole other question. Yeah.
And there wouldn't be a mechanism for what it just does.
Not an external mechanism. It would be what it is. Yeah.
Oh, right. That's exactly right.
Yeah. I was right. He said so.
This is how we do Q&A. This microphone over here for questions to Matt. Microphone over there, questions to Blake. I'm going to insist, keep your questions germane to the topic. If you consumed a lot of beer, ask your question to your neighbor before you get on a live microphone on a live stream. I'm just putting that out there. Ask that your questions be 2 minutes or less. I've come to find that for whatever reason, Timex doesn't work the same on the arm of a theist and a non-theist. That's 120 seconds. At 121, your mic will be muted, and you're just waving your arms with no sound. Yes, someone said thank you. They've seen these before.
And also, Blake and I are in agreement, and we will jointly shut your ass down so that you can't blame either of us independently.
See? 2 minutes. We're also taking questions online, and we have lots of questions submitted. If you don't want to be videotaped, send your questions to questions@thebibleandbeerconsortium.com. It's long as a litmus, so drunk people don't send stuff in. We're going to start over here with BBC alumni, Dr. Zach Moore.
Yay.
Question for Matt.
So Matt, you've talked about a lot. You talked a lot about sort of the reasons why you don't believe in God and all the skepticism that you have. But I'm wondering if you could sort of, think hypothetically. What if there were a God and you could control what kind of God there would be? What kind of a God would you want there to be?
I'm not sure. So it depends. Oh, wow. I'm not sure that I would actually want there to be a God. Maybe a deistic type of God that just sits out there and watches for whatever reason. Although the watching thing's still kind of creepy. So it's not that. So my reasons for not believing aren't because I didn't want there to be a God. I set out to fulfill my obligation under 1 Peter 3:15 and failed spectacularly. Yeah. But as I've thought about it a lot more, I don't think that there's anything that would actually qualify as a God that I would necessarily want there to be. There may be some that I might mind a little less. At a minimum, it would need to be one that was open, that was willing to communicate and interact clearly and obviously with those of us who are down here. Hey, what do you like? Otherwise it doesn't matter. If there's some God that doesn't care, doesn't interact with me, well, I don't really want anything to do with it. I mean, the whole thing of it can squash you like a bug. Yes, it can, and it would be a moral thug. I would say, but.
Thank you. Sure.
Yeah, I don't know if the question makes too much sense for me. But
What kind of God would you like, Blake?
Well, it just so happens. No, I mean, so it's interesting. So I know you did talk a bit about the hiddenness, and there's so many responses and considerations to bring up in response to that. It's hard to do it in any brief amount of time. But it does seem to me that if you're going to try to make an argument for hiddenness, not necessarily that you are immediately in this question here, that there's a number of things you'd have to establish along the way. You're going to have to establish that the entity doesn't have morally sufficient reasons, of course, for wanting to not make himself apparent. And, I mean, just for example, the entity at least proposed by theism on the greatest possible being, he doesn't have an interest in just making himself known. God wants people to enter into a relationship, and if you're going to be such that either you immediately would reject him, or maybe would reject him later in life, or maybe something you do in your life would ultimately result in fewer people entering into a relationship with him, those kinds of things. I mean, there's just a ton of considerations into why God does things the way he does, and it's very hard to do that, to figure that out.
Question for Blake.
Okay. The assertion's been made that God does not exist because he cannot be measured scientifically. It's an interesting thing. I went to Vanderbilt University and studied physics. I got a Vanderbilt person here. Thank you. Anyway, one of the interesting things about physics is that when we take gravity, we can see its effects, but scientists cannot measure any gravity waves or gravity particles. Therefore, by the standard that if we cannot scientifically measure it or detect it, it doesn't exist. Shall we then assume that gravity does not exist on the same criterion that God does not exist?
So, I mean, that's obviously
The
a
both
question.
of you, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think I wish we all had more time always. There's so many things I want to talk about with Matt's methodology, and you only have time to go over a little bit of it. But, I mean, that sounds like a reasonable worry to me. I guess you could try to say you can still gather evidence for it, for these other particles or fields, or I don't know. How would you go about that?
So first of all, I didn't say that God doesn't exist because it can't be demonstrated scientifically. I didn't state that there's a fact that God doesn't exist because what I'm saying is that I do not find it reasonable to believe this, and perhaps reasonable to actually believe that it's not true. However, if God were as obvious as gravity, I'd believe.
Then Matt, okay, still got a couple minutes?
Please.
A couple seconds. Then anything you can't see simply does not exist. So you can't see
It's not about
ultraviolet
seeing.
radiation, so it doesn't exist. But
It's not about seeing. I don't see the wind, but I do see the effects of the wind. And if God was as obvious as the wind, I'd believe.
And so your colleague here would say, I can see the effects of God in creation. It's very obvious to me. And take the example of human life. The size of a fertilized egg, the nucleus is 1/5000th of an inch.
Okay.
And
If
it
he
grows
said-
into 1.4 trillion cells in 9 months.
If he said that he
and
could...
it has a program that creates hundreds of different types of cells
Yeah.
in 9 months.
If
You
he's-
can't see how that works, but it still does.
If he said that he could see the wind and the effects of the wind, and I couldn't, I'm not justified in believing. We learned from Hume very early that revelation is necessarily first person and to everybody else it's hearsay. His witness of the wind is hearsay to me and is insufficient for me to believe the wind. So merely him saying that he can see the wind. Now the thing is, this is why science relies on independent verification. The time to believe something is when people desperately try to falsify this and come up with the same results. There's a consistency there. And I'm not saying that God doesn't exist because we can't do this. I'm saying that because we can't do this, I have no good reason to think that it's true, whether it's true or not.
Now drop your pencil above the earth in a space capsule and it doesn't fall.
Well, you just disproved my point.
Question submitted
God doesn't
online.
exist in space, I guess.
I think he does, but we'll stop. Question submitted online by Steve for Blake. If God exists, how come I have to submit my question to you guys to get answers?
Actually, so again, as usual, there are several things to point out, but one interesting thing is on this hypothesis, right? A moral arena is a very good thing, and one of the great goods in the world is actually that God has given an opportunity for some individuals like myself to be able to play a role in helping others, and being able to answer questions like that is a great good for me, and so that could be one of several reasons.
Question from Matt.
Yeah, Matt, you said, or at least intimated, that something can't exist unless it exists in space-time. Why do you believe that?
That's just the definition of existence. Is there anything other than the supernatural for which we can't confirm? Sure. That when we say this exists, that the existence is a temporal process. If it exists for 0 seconds, that's non-existence. If it exists with no space, that's non-existence. Now, you can get into, concepts and abstract things, but I would say that to the extent they exist only as mental states. Like if you remove all the minds, 7 vanishes from the universe so far as I can tell.
Very good.
So,
Blake?
you say it's the definition of existence. I don't think that's right. And I mean, there are theories of existence where people there's a lot written on these. And so one theory of existence would be something exists just in case it exemplifies properties. And that's not incompatible with something existing independently of space and time.
So
if you define, sorry to interrupt, if you define existence that way, then you just defined all sorts of philosophical positions out of.
Sure. If I said define the definition of existence, first let me be clear. Words don't have intrinsic meaning, they have usages. So under the common usage of when we say something exists, we're never talking about something existing outside of reality other than the proposed God thing. I don't know, the supernatural, that entire realm is the only thing that's proposed that's not part of reality.
Well, I mean, I think God is part of reality. I think that there are moral truths that are part of reality. It's interesting because every time I posit something that I think that exists outside of what you're calling reality, but what you actually mean is space-time, every time I posit something outside of space-time, you're just going to say, and I reject that. But I mean, so you may have a coherent internal position, but you can't use your internal definition of existence as an argument against my position.
No, all I can do is say that what you're positing, so far as I can tell, it seems incoherent to me. I don't know. I don't understand what it means to say something exists outside of space and time. I don't even know that qualifies as a realm. Like if there is something that is like extra space or extra time.
See, this is where you would come back normally to someone who said that and said, well, just because you don't understand it doesn't mean it's right. That's what you'd say to someone else who said something like that.
Well, just because you don't understand it,
or it doesn't make sense.
It is fine to not believe it.
Yeah.
Just because. So when you say this is where you'd come back to somebody saying just because you don't understand doesn't mean it's not true. That's correct. I'm not saying it's not true. I'm saying because it is, I don't understand it, because nobody's offered any explanation. I cannot believe it. That's separate from whether or not it's true.
But you can't use it as an argument against me now just because you don't believe it.
Only to the extent that your argument is that it's reasonable to believe this, I can use it against the argument that it's reasonable to believe.
So you're saying...
I can't use it as an argument that it is not in fact true. I can only use it, if you say that
Let's stay with the question.
Ezra's giving us the eyeball.
Yeah, no. Cross-examination ended. Question from the floor for Blake.
My name is Warren Beam. I was introduced to Jesus at age 9 in 1974 by the Burning Hell movie in an independent fundamental Baptist church, and attended regularly through age 17. Just to give some context for my background. Matt said something that I think is relevant, that theists don't choose just any God, they choose a specific God and reject the rest. So perhaps a more precise title for this debate is, does the Belek God exist? So Belek is biblical, literal, evangelical Christian. So you also brought up the concept of morality and moral awareness. And by the way, I'm passionate about knowledge management. I love your belief in the map as a tool, so kudos to you. You talk about God giving us moral awareness, the ability to morally reason. So I suggest you would answer no to this question. Would you, or if any person, put their child or pet in a burning fireplace for even 10 seconds to punish them? Is that moral? And I suspect you'd say no, it's immoral for a person to do that, and it's because we have the ability to morally reason. So therefore, if one was to ask, and I'll ask you, Blake, is it morally reasonable for the be-like God to punish the majority of the world's population, billions of people in hell, for all eternity in conscious punishment for a finite life that has free will limitations? In other words...
So that's a lot. Already I've got 3 things I got to deal with.
Anyway, is it morally right for God to send people to hell, and how do you justify that? Okay. That's the question.
So I have the second one in my mind. I'm going to have to ask you about the first one again, because the first one did kind of lead into the question of would you okay something, in this case like burning a child, if God said it was okay. And I just wanted to point out that to the degree that I was confident that this was morally wrong, to an equal degree I would be confident that God would not bring it about. So that's point number 1. Regarding your question about hell, there are, I shouldn't even be answering this. I committed to myself that I wouldn't be talking about the Christian God, but I already started. All right, everyone, from now on, I'm not talking about the Christian God. I'm going to answer this though, because I already started. There are all different kinds of theories of hell and why hell is eternal. Here's one quick one. And not all people accept that hell is eternal. Some people are annihilationists, and then that's fine. But here's one theory, is no finite punishment that you commit on earth results in you being punished for eternity in hell. What happens is you're sent to hell, and I don't accept that it's fire, okay? It's described as outer darkness and all sorts of things. It's anguish of some kind. Good is taken away. But one reason why it would, or the reason on this model, why it lasts eternally is because the individual continues to gnash their teeth at God. They continue to sin, and so their sentence is perpetuated. So that's one theory. Oh, sorry, and what was the first question?
Well, I want, just to finish my question.
Sorry, it's got to be the first question.
Whatever the first question was.
Why I made a statement about it's the be like God, and for context, to limit it, is it right to put a child in a fireplace? Okay. And what about the folks who flew airplanes into the Twin Towers? They believe God told them to do that. So
I'd say at this point, because he's already answered that question, if you've got another one, maybe just get back in line and we'll kind of move on from there.
Sounds good. I'll do that. Thank you.
Cool, thanks.
Thank you.
Question online for both speakers from Josh. 2-part. What line of possible evidence or argumentation do you think could change your mind? After you both answer, the other please comment on any problems you see in the other speaker's answer.
Oh, wow.
I answered it in my opening. I don't know, but if there's a God, that God should know and hasn't, so that's my answer. I have no idea.
It's always going to be degreed. So basically, if someone tore down my reasons for believing in God sufficiently, while on balance also taking down my answers for, for instance, the problem of evil and the problem of hiddenness, things can balance. There's no quick answer. It's going to be a more of a complex calculation like what I showed on the screen for me.
Oh, he wanted us to comment on each other's thing, I guess. So what's wrong with my answer, man?
It was just bad. I just didn't like it.
God probably doesn't like it either, which is why he hasn't done it.
Question.
So I'd say the only comment on yours is that, if it were the case that somebody actually went through each of your reasons and showed why they were fallacious, or why they weren't good reasons, and you were willing to change your mind once that was done, good for you.
Question for Matt.
Hey, Matt. I'm part of a street epistemology group, and unfortunately, that was just
with Andrew.
Yeah, and that was just my question. So I'll have to ask him a question if that's okay. And I know it's kind of sorry, but you can answer too if you want. If God has the rights over life, like you suggested earlier, how would we judge a mother who kills her child and claims God told her to do it?
So I'll start, since it's technically.
Yeah, Sir, if God has rights over life, somehow I missed it.
If God has rights over life.
That you claimed earlier. You claimed earlier that God has rights over life,
Oh
so
yeah,
he can take it at any time.
And then continue the question.
And if he asked a mother to kill her child, drown him in a tub,
Okay.
how would we know how on earth how to judge them in a court system?
Gotcha.
Yeah, so
Based on your-
I would say, putting on my Southern Baptist hat, I don't know how to demonstrate that God actually asked her to do that. And I think the default assumption is that probably for almost everybody, we probably don't think God actually did that. She may just be, mentally have issues. But what I would say is that there is an argument along those lines that for particular theologies that have this age of reason or the age of responsibility, where it would be, I think, perhaps argued that the most moral act you could do would be to kill your offspring before they reach that so that they would go to heaven and not have the opportunity to sin. But that is about very specific theology. The reason that I had asked Blake about, the morality of drowning an infant, which we didn't quite finish, is that if you believe the Noah story, God did that. Now, I don't think the Noah story ever happened, and I know that there's a lot of people who aren't biblical literalists and who may not think that happened at all, but it's a representation of God's character according to the Bible, which we're evidently not going to get into today. But my specific point on that was that drowning is a particularly horrible way to die. And so even if God had some motivation that was just to kill somebody and has the rights over life and death, I think it's a cop-out to just say he has rights over life and death and not assess the manner in which he might go about it, because even if I had the right to kill somebody, that doesn't necessarily mean I have the right to torture them and make them die in the most heinous way I can think of. And I think that's a problem that I was trying to get at that we kind of derailed. But
I mean, the question would be, could she provide any serious convincing evidence that this was actually from God? And kind of like Matt alluded to, I think that would be very hard to do. So for whatever that's worth, I don't know.
Would it be any easier for any other claim that God told you something?
To some degree, it would be easier to believe that God told you to do something good, but even that I would only accept in virtue of evidence. It would just require a little bit less.
Cool. Thank you, too.
Thanks.
Question for Blake?
For Blake. With everything that you laid out in the first 30 minutes and all your rebuttals, is that what first convinced you to start believing? And if not, why?
No. I mean,
What convinced
if you ask me why it was in this process, I just had no idea about these other arguments. In fact, probably what I found first convincing were a series of arguments that, in retrospect, are terrible. So the first arguments were something along the lines of, well, I'm not even going to mention them; they're so bad. It was like, well,
that's a good idea.
Yeah.
I had those same ones.
Right. I'll stop there.
So yeah, and I like this thing because, and this is not a slight against Blake, and I will keep it short. I find very often in these debates that it's very rare that people actually defend the God that they believe in, and this is not slamming you. We agreed on this particular topic. Mm-hmm. And that even when they do, they don't always offer the reasons that they're convinced. Instead, they offer the reasons that they think should be convincing to someone else. That doesn't mean that they're wrong. It doesn't mean that their arguments are fallacious. And I hear atheists, and this is the only reason I'm commenting here, going after like William Lane Craig, who believes because of the inner witness of the Holy Spirit, and yet argues from Kalam. It is not a rebuttal to Kalam to say that Craig believes on the basis of the inner witness of the Holy Spirit. Those two things are completely separate. You can rebut Kalam another time, and then you can point out the problem with the inner witness as well, which I'd love to do if Craig would ever debate me. Oh, did I say that live streamed?
You did.
Hi, Bill.
You did.
But yeah, I don't like bad arguments, no matter where they come from, but I especially despise bad arguments when they're coming from people who are ostensibly on my side of an issue, which is why I find myself fighting with some of my atheist friends on occasion, because that's a bad argument. Not your point, the thing that I went to.
Just a quick point myself. You might have noticed the debate was originally titled something along the lines of, did Jesus rise from the dead? That was going to be our original topic. We had reasons for changing that.
Which I really wanted to do.
I know. I wanted to as well. So I just want to say that it's not like illicit to try to approach a bigger question like, is Christianity true, by first focusing on something that it entails, like, does God exist? And that's a very noble question to start with, even if you want to add on more to that later.
And there we're in complete agreement. Yeah. Because when I started my falling away, and we'll get right to your question, I swear, as soon I realized I couldn't be a Christian. And then it was, well, what can I be? What God might be right. I don't believe this biblical literalism. Maybe there's another version, et cetera. And I realized that I would not have time in my life to evaluate all the different God claims. And so it was much smarter, much wiser to go to the philosophical questions, to go to the meta-level questions and talk about what kind of God might exist or could exist in order to help direct the search. I joked that I started with Buddhism to figure out if I'd have multiple lives to address the question. But then I went to philosophy.
So,
one more.
So Blake, is Matt correct that you use all of this to defend your reason for believing?
I genuinely believe that this is a foundation for my believing, yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Question submitted online by Eric for Matt. How is using science to prove science, not circular reasoning?
We don't use science to prove science. It's not like there's a scientific method that we use to confirm the scientific method. It's not even like there's one scientific method. The principles of science, or skepticism and critical thinking, are this idea that we shouldn't believe something until it's been well established and supported by argument and evidence, and that we should make every attempt to falsify it, to demonstrate that it's wrong. And it's this independent confirmation and evaluation that gives us, as I mentioned earlier, a probabilistic understanding that the model we've created of the universe matches the universe as best we can. I have a t-shirt which I sold for years, which is, I want to believe as many true things and as few false things as possible. That is my view of the foundation of skepticism, which leads to science. Science isn't proving science. Science is simply the single most consistently, demonstrably reliable method that we have for coming to reasonable, accurate models of reality.
So,
put that on a t-shirt.
So, I think that there are several truths that can be known and justified independently of science. And of course, if you're going to go in saying that this, all the truth, this can be a bit circular, right? Because if you're not willing to acknowledge these other domains of knowledge, then of course you're going to say, well, everything that needs to be known is already known by science. And it can be very hard to penetrate that for reasons that I went into earlier. I think the question, though, is getting at something that I pointed out earlier, more precisely, that, look, you're going to have science. Again, every scientific explanation comes in terms of laws acting on initial conditions. That's what the enterprise of science is about. That's what we pay our scientists to look for. Even if you're a theist who doesn't think that everything has a natural explanation, you pay the scientists to look for the natural explanations. That's a great good. It's a delegation of responsibility. I don't want them to stop. But at the same time, we have to acknowledge that you can't explain everything that way, at least because you can't explain the initial conditions and the laws of physics that way.
But would it be fair to, so I would agree with all of that. I think I would agree with all that. But of the things that you can't explain that way, to say that you can't explain them another way is a claim that needs to be demonstrated.
Wait, a claim that I'm saying that they can't be explained another way? Because I do think they have an explanation.
That's what I'm saying. You think that those things that can't be explained by science can be explained some other way.
Correct.
And that is what I think needs to actually be demonstrated. Because to me, the God hypothesis has no explanatory power, because we explain things in terms of other things that we understand, and so explaining things in terms of something we don't understand is not actually an explanation, it's just a response.
Yeah. Can I continue?
Sure.
Yeah, I was going to say, look, there's this principle of sufficient reason where it wants to say, look, every contingent fact, like, Matt is bald. That has an explanation because it didn't have to be true. But necessary facts like 2 + 2 = 4, those don't need explanations. But we have a lot. There's full cases built in defense of the principle of sufficient reason. And so for example, here's a problem. If you don't think everything has a sufficient explanation, then consider your here's something that could be happening.
I'm not sure that's my position, but go ahead.
Okay, so what could be happening right now is you could be just having this mental experience that you're having right now for no reason at all.
Okay.
So you don't want that consequence. That's a bad consequence. And so that's one of several reasons for, or several arguments in favor of the belief in the principle of sufficient reason, that everything should have an explanation. At least prima facie, you should grant that everything probably has an explanation. If anything's magic, it's saying that it doesn't have an explanation.
No, I think I'm kind of convinced that there are some things that may not have or need an explanation. I tend to reject the idea of properly basic beliefs. We should table this and do it as a side podcast along with substance dualism and stuff, because this is way too much.
All right, very good.
Yeah.
Question for Matt.
Well, this is unfortunate because I have a metaphysical question. So
Oh.
But Matt, thank you so much for coming out, and Blake,
Thanks.
I really enjoyed it. I guess my question, I understand you didn't have an opportunity to actually have a rebuttal, but in your opening statement, you mentioned, one, that you rejected an axiom of modal logic, and two, that Blake was, in his definition of God, perhaps instead of having omnipresent or omniscience, has made more of a fine-tuned version, or I guess wording of it.
His wording was maximally.
Maximally, sure.
Yeah.
But I guess
Which is common.
Yeah, but I guess my question is, just because we can better communicate what we mean by such words by using maximally or agency or something like that, how would you reject certain metaphysical truths such as the laws of logic and
I don't.
consciousness? You don't reject them?
No. And also, when I mentioned this thing about how these terms have been redefined by modern theologians, I'm not complaining. I think they were right to do so. Okay. I think that they recognized real problems. And so one of the things that they did was they said, okay, clearly if we stick to this idea that God can do anything, even the logically impossible, we have now moved off into the realm of complete unreasonableness. And so the God that we believe in should be reasonable. As a matter of fact, the God that I believed in was not only reasonable, but evident and obvious. And so it was kind of a surprise to find out that I was wrong about at least two of those three. So I don't have any problem with this. I was commenting on a meta level about how the conversation has continued, and what's happened is that instead of, like if you had a proposed explanation for something and you found out that it was wrong and flawed, to go back and rework your definitions so that you could try to make your explanation and redefine your explanation so that it would fit, that's a problem. Because now you're in the position where you've got a foregone conclusion and you're desperately trying to make things fit it. You may be correct. I mean, there are plenty of people who had great ideas that were really convinced that this is the way it is, and it failed and failed and failed until they found some other way. So I'm not saying that it proves that they're false. I'm saying that as a methodology, to get stuck into there must be a God. And so when I present the cosmological argument and somebody points out, that everything that exists has a cause, if God exists, he must have a cause, to go back and reformat the first premise to be everything that begins to exist, now you're doing ad hoc redefinition of the thing you're trying to prove in order to try and prove it. And I'm much more an advocate of following the evidence where it goes, and if it leads to a God, cool. But I don't see that as the case. So that was my only objection.
Could I have a quick follow-up? Okay, so you just said following the evidence where it leads. A lot of explanations or definitions of God that Blake used were inferences made to metaphysics, not necessarily positing God. So hasn't he shown logically, at least at some level, to possibly consider a metaphysical answer to a physical question? So wouldn't your objection constantly go back to that needs a physical explanation, that needs a physical explanation?
No, it's not that it needs a physical explanation. It's that if you're going to offer a metaphysical explanation, it's not enough to say that this metaphysical explanation is consistent with the facts that we observe. There has to be some demonstration that it is in some way real. This is where I kind of get, and this will be sidetracked. It's kind of like saying, we need to solve this problem. We need an explanation for this. So I'm going to hypothesize the perfect explanation. This satisfies all the conditions. It does me no good to say that on this hypothetical explanation, we would expect all of the things that we were trying to explain. That is ultimately circular in some sense. And to say that it's unlikely under any other possibilities is also unsurprising, because you've constructed the one thing. That tells me nothing at all about whether or not that's the actual explanation, which is why I used the card example. It may, in fact, be incredibly more likely that I cheated and dealt those cards to you. But that doesn't mean that's what happened, and it also doesn't mean that you can reasonably conclude that I, in fact, cheated. Just because it happens to be more likely on the hypothesis doesn't mean it's reasonable to conclude that that is what is, actually happened. You may say it's more likely in comparison. I care about what's actually correct. It doesn't mean anything to me to say that a moral realm is more likely on theism than atheism. Seriously, it means nothing to me because it does not confirm that theism is actually the answer. Of course, if you want to list all the improbabilities that had to happen to get here, that's going to be a problem.
So I don't like this all or nothing talk of demonstrate. I really do think that it's important to talk about evidence, which can increase or decrease in a degreed manner. It doesn't have to be either, full on. If this piece of data doesn't demonstrate that this is true, then this piece of data doesn't do any work at all.
That's not what I was saying.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure because that's sort of
not a
like,
single. No.
Okay.
It's what is the preponderance of the evidence? The disagreement here is probably going to be about what you're willing to consider as evidence versus what I'm willing to consider as evidence.
Maybe.
But I don't know.
I had a point and now I lost it.
It's my fault.
And you're not even drinking.
Thanks.
I know that.
You're not drinking. I had a margarita.
Wait.
What?
I don't know.
Hold on, let me see if I can remember. I had an amazing point, guys. You just have to believe me. All
I'll
go ahead.
take your word. I'll take
While
it
you're
on faith.
thinking of it, Peter, question for Blake.
Hey, Peter.
Hey, how's it going? So I have like two real quick questions, and I promise I'll make it quick.
Okay.
So my first question is, I'm really impressed by consciousness in the human brain and how all of these different parts of our brain seem to be necessary to give rise to a consciousness that enables us to do a lot of things. And I'm not sure if this is exactly what you're saying, but what is really an argument that often seems to be made is, look at our brains and look at how they're conscious and how they can come up with moral laws and connect to moral rules and all that. How does that connect to? He's looking at his watch. How does that connect to? That's all necessary for consciousness. So therefore, there must be a consciousness that doesn't have any of the brain stuff attached to it, that's kind of disembodied.
No, I wouldn't say that.
When you talk about a disembodied mind, I'm kind of curious as to how you can come up with that concept, especially if you're saying that the disembodied mind is necessary to come up with the concept of to have a mind that comes up with moral truths and that type of deal.
Coming up with the concept of a disembodied mind is very easy. In fact, if you didn't have any sense perception, kind of like I alluded to before, you wouldn't have a notion of matter or space at all. You would be, all you would know is a mind, period. So it's very coherent.
Right, so you're saying that all of the stuff that we have in our brains that seems like it's functioning, consciousness in a certain way is not necessary for consciousness.
All I'm saying,
to have that outside of it.
Yeah, it's certainly conceivable, and yes, I see no reason to think it's necessary, right, for there to be a particular medium. I think that in our cases, yes, we do have a medium. I think I'm an interaction. When we were going to talk about dualism, I think there's an interaction between the mind and the brain, and I have reasons for thinking that. But I don't think that. I think for the reason I gave, it's perfectly coherent to talk about a disembodied mind.
Is there strong evidence that we have that it is possible to have consciousness that's not connected to matter in any way?
Interestingly, every argument for God's existence is evidence, incidentally, for the possibility of a disembodied mind. Also, I just made a conceivability argument, and I noted in my opening statement that conceivability arguments get used to help determine what's metaphysically possible.
Or is it possibly a little bit more possible that people saw, okay, consciousness is how we create things, therefore we're going to apply that same concept to an entity for the way we got here.
Sorry, I missed the first half of that. I apologize.
That's my fault. I was asking for iced tea.
Is it more possible that human beings said, okay, consciousness is the way that we create things, therefore that must be the way that we somehow got here, kind of extending it out?
I don't accept the notion of more possibly. Something's either possible or impossible.
And the real
So
quick-
there's something to what you said that I find interesting, which is this idea that it's easy to conceive of a mind without a brain because it's easy to conceive of all kinds of things. That whether or not you can conceive them doesn't tell you whether or not they're possible or probable or likely or true. But something you just said about this idea of consciousness acting and doing something. We have no examples of a consciousness acting and doing something. We have no examples of a mind absent physicality. We also have no examples of consciousness acting absent a physical modus operandi, which doesn't mean that God doesn't have one. Never mind. This is just the way my brain works after a margarita.
And my other question was, how do you know that God, the concept of God having authority, moral authority, seems to be kind of, there seems to be a concept that in God that he somehow has moral authority, that he has authority over all existence. Even if there was a being that was somehow conscious, which I think is far-fetched, obviously, but even if there was a being that was somehow conscious that did bring all this into being, how do you give that being the concept of authority that would be necessary for most theories of who God would be?
So there are, once again, there are different models on how you can, are you basically asking how could you get to the inference that God is all good?
Or how could you get to God somehow having authority over existence as opposed to just being some conscious being? Like if I made a world, I just have to make the world.
Is this just for clarity, because is this a distinction between the might makes right thing and whether or not there is a moral authority?
I guess. Well, I'm just trying to figure out
So, I mean, I'm going to take the earlier question because figuring out what you mean by an authority and how the necessary and sufficient conditions for being an authority, that's kind of a complex issue. But, I mean, there are theories about why God would be an all-good being. If you want to hear some of those models, for instance, I suggested that God could very simply have. I said that God has 2 or 3 interesting properties, which is in my case for saying that God is simple. On the model where you have 2 simple properties, God's being all-knowing, we want to say that the moral truths are necessary truths, and so God being omniscient would be able to know those necessary truths, and it's in virtue of that he would be an all-good being. If you want to add in that 3rd property, you would just add in omnibenevolence, and that would be part of God's being the greatest possible being.
All right, I'll just leave it. Thanks.
Okay. Question from Jonathan for Blake. Why is it that you hold atheism to a different standard of probability than theism? Using your model, would it not be possible for a God to exist without the universe, or for a God to create a universe that would not support life? In a fair comparison, your end result would be that atheism and theism are at best equally possible.
I didn't say that the likelihood of a moral arena given theism is 100%. In fact, I don't think it's 100%. God could have refrained from creating. I said that most people put the likelihood between 10 and 90%. That's very much the kind of thing that God would plausibly do, and I think that's right.
I don't.
Do you need another margarita?
No, I'm good with tea, believe me.
All right. Matt, this is my daughter, Simeon.
Yes, we met a while ago.
She's going to ask you a question.
Please.
So I went to the door to hear Dan Barker and Justin Bass debate, and there was this atheist that was asking my mom and my brother a question, and he was saying, how can you be a Christian and rely on just a book? I think that the evidence of people existing might be evidence enough if basically what I'm trying to say is, isn't the existence of people evidence enough?
So Blake said something interesting a minute ago that I didn't really capitalize on, where he said the arguments for God were evidence of this. Arguments are not, in fact, evidence. They're the conclusions may be, if they're sound, but a mere argument. So is the evidence of people enough? Not if there's a naturalistic explanation for it. And even if there weren't a naturalistic explanation for it, that doesn't mean that we are justified in proposing or accepting a supernatural explanation. So if you walked in the house and you found a potted plant sitting on the foyer and you had no idea how it got there, would the mere existence of the potted plant be enough for you to believe that angels delivered it there? Even if you didn't have another explanation, there could be other explanations. It could be parents, it could be, any number of things. So the actual existence of something isn't on its own evidence for why it exists. You have to actually show why something exists. So, and we can quite often, we can't always. And if we can show why something is there, then we have an explanation. And if we can't, then the correct position, in my mind, is to say, we don't currently have an explanation for this. I don't know how it happened. But if we don't know how, I don't think that we're justified in claiming that we do. And the disagreement here is that for the existence of human beings, I think there's a perfectly natural explanation for that. Blake thinks, and I don't want to put words in his mouth, that the natural explanation for the existence of human beings may need something else, I guess, some intervention?
The argument that I gave can go two different ways. In fact, technically, with the argument that I gave, you don't have to believe that there are any supernatural interventions at all. Theoretically, the theism, the God in that, could have created the one very special world where all of these things cascaded in just the right way. I incidentally do believe in an interventionist God.
Which is what I thought.
Yeah.
Yeah. I hope that's as close to an answer. I don't know if I can answer it any better than that.
Oh, I also have a part two.
Okay.
Whoa.
Earlier, we were talking, and you said, how did I offend you?
Mm-hmm. How did I offend you? Yes.
Well, the godless dogs thing was kind of offensive.
The godless... Oh, the name of my wife's podcast. Well, I didn't say that. He did. But... To be fair to your father, he was reading what my wife named her podcast, and she's watching right now. Honey, you named your podcast something that offended Simeon. And maybe she'll either send you an email to apologize or to explain perhaps why it's not necessarily something that one should be offended by. But in any case, I am sorry that you're offended.
I forgive you.
Goodness. Question for
Get
Blake.
that girl a beer.
Yeah, Dr. Ben.
No, not that. But
Yeah.
Not a doctor just yet, but thank you guys again. This has been a really wonderful evening. I think they all deserve another round of applause. I have two questions. One of them is quite short. Blake, during your discussion on the origins of life, you mentioned something, and I hope I get this right, the RNA Ward hypothesis?
World.
Sorry, I'm unfamiliar with that. Could you explain to me just briefly what that is?
Yeah, so in the origin of life problem, the dominant idea was that you needed both DNA and proteins, the central dogma, in order to get a system where more proteins could be made and more DNA, and you can have this system of replicating life. Well, this is really hard, it turns out, to bring out. There's so many interacting parts that have to be there all at once in order for the system to work. So one idea that was proposed was the RNA world hypothesis, whereby maybe the RNA could be the replicator and do sort of the work of coding without without invoking the central dogma at all. I don't know. Does that help?
Yeah. I just didn't know anything about it. Okay. So my second question is not related to that one at all. It is with respect to something that Matt has said a little bit ago concerning what does or does not count as evidence, because there's apparently some kind of difference between what you think counts as evidence for you and what Matt thinks counts as evidence for him.
to be fair, I would add the good evidence, because it sounds like I'm dismissing things like anecdotal evidence, which I think counts as evidence.
Which is totally
negligible.
Fine. It's okay. Totally fine. A lot of what I would have been asking about was the principle of sufficient reason, because I completely agree with you with respect to this. But with respect to what it means to be properly falsifiable, which is a term that Matt used, this is a question for you, Blake.
Yeah.
If you were to adopt the epistemic stance of Matt, this skepticism, which says that what is scientific is going to count as the best evidence, and anything that's not scientific, I'm not going to count as good evidence. Maybe it's evidence, but it's not good evidence. It seems to me that if you were thinking this way, you would be building into your definition of what counts as good scientific evidence the following things.
Right.
You would be building in methodological naturalism. So you're only going to be looking for naturalistic explanations. And if something presents itself that is a supernatural explanation, because you're governed by methodological naturalism and thinking through this, you're going to say, I'm going to bracket that out. That's not under consideration at this point. That's not part of the evidence that I'm willing to consider as good evidence. Now, it seems to me that if you were doing this, Blake, that you wouldn't find any reason at all, ever under any circumstances, that even could count as evidence for theism if that's the only stuff that you count as good enough evidence to substantially contribute to something. Now, I would say if you were thinking that way, Blake, you would have stacked the deck in your favor.
Right.
Now, philosophers call this the fallacy of begging the question. And in this case, it has taken place by limiting what could or could not count as evidence in the first place. So I presume you would not want to appropriate that kind of epistemic stance in the first place. So maybe you could reverse engineer this for us and explain just where that kind of thought process goes wrong. And I'll take my answer.
Are you a T-ball coach?
No, but I do have an 11-year-old who plays center field, and he is awesome.
Because that one was teed up perfectly, I'll let you know.
Well, actually, I actually know that what Matt's going to do is he's going to say, well, look, it's the scientific method has this great success rate, right? And so this kind of epistemology has been verified to some degree. Is that right before I continue? Is that?
Yeah, I'd also point out it wasn't me that stacked the deck or stacked the questions. I'm accepting that the scientific method,
Yeah.
I'm accepting a particular epistemology because it's proven effective and alternates have not.
And this is where I'll come back and say, well, look, on the theistic worldview, you do believe that 99.99% of the time, natural explanations are going to be right. That's why we set up science, and that's why we have no problem with telling them, look, don't think about God. You come up with the best naturalistic explanation you can. That is what we pay you for. That is your job. We're going to take that, and once we have the best naturalistic explanation in our hands, that's what you take to the philosophy department, and then you try to discern whether the best naturalistic explanation is the best explanation overall. And maybe one philosopher could try to say, well, the methodological naturalism is true based on this success rate argument, but I think that's a bad philosophical argument, and that's why it's my awareness is just not used. And the reason it's a bad philosophical argument is because you would have just as much success on methodological almost naturalism. And so if you have just as much success on both, you can't use that to verify this idea of methodological naturalism as your governing epistemology for all knowledge.
Well, we're back to the just as much success thing, which I already addressed, and they can rewind. My problem with theism isn't that it's going to hold that 99.99% of the time naturalistic explanations are correct. It's that theism proposes that the remaining percent is covered by something that they cannot demonstrate. It's not the fault of rational human beings, not that you're not rational, that was phrased poorly. Sure. It's not the fault of the method that someone has proposed. You could propose all sorts of methods that say we're going to accept 99.99%, or that naturalism is going to get it right this amount of the time, and here's what we're going to say about the rest. This is what happens. This is why there are 1,000 different denominations of Christianity and countless gods and supernatural propositions throughout history, none of which have been reasonably confirmed to actually be true and accurate. At best, they are simply claiming this, on my particular hypothesis, this would be expected and it is consistent with. Well, correlation isn't causation, and an accumulation of claims is not an accumulation of data, it's accumulation of ignorance.
So here's something that I want to ask you about. So suppose that you just experienced all the eschatological events, described in the book of Revelation, and next you found yourself at the pearly gates being judged by God, and next thing, you're in some kind of outer darkness, hell, and this has been going on for a while. Do you have evidence that God exists now, or would you believe that God exists now?
So, that's a laundry list of things.
Yeah.
And I would say that if I found myself at the pearly gates, by definition, we're now in some other realm, or at least I'm experiencing
you're having an
it.
experience, right?
Sure. I would want independent verification of what I experience to the best of my ability to do so. That does not mean that I'm going to sit there and say, nope, what I'm experiencing is clearly a delusion. Because no matter what I'm experiencing, whether I'm a brain in a vat or I'm stuck in the matrix or I am experiencing this purported afterlife, until such time as I have reason to think that what I'm experiencing is delusion and have some way out, I have to deal with reality I experience on its own terms. So it's not about whether or not I would believe that it was true. I would believe that I was experiencing that, and that's the distinction.
But I'm asking you about whether you'd believe it's true, and to my understanding, I know it's the truth. The scientist is not allowed to conclude that there's a God and this is all occurring, and so isn't this a bad method if the conclusion doesn't allow you to conclude in the face of such great evidence that God exists?
So you're saying in the face of such great evidence, and great is kind of an equivocation here, because is it about the quality or the quantity that makes it great?
It's got both.
In my assessment here, first of all, as I mentioned, science doesn't look to get you to truth. It comes up with the best explanations.
But you're using it to get you to truth.
No. I'm using science for what it's used for, which is get me to the best supported probabilistic explanations of the reality. Now, to the extent that I experience
Sorry for interrupting, but you believe things are true or false on the basis of those?
No, I believe things are likely true. So it depends. So this gets to the issue that, thankfully, we've avoided the entire night, which is absolute certainty. Because I'm of the position that absolute certainty is a red herring that's unattainable. Outside of the logical absolutes, which we accept, I say, as presuppositions, and so we're still not absolutely certain there. So I'm not concerned with absolute certainty. What I'm willing to do is say that whatever I experience, I'm experiencing. This is like when somebody comes and tells me that they had this experience that they attribute to God. I don't think they're lying. I am fully willing to accept that they had some experience. The exact nature of that experience, I'm not necessarily convinced is what they're relaying, and the cause that they want to ascribe to the experience, I am not personally convinced of. So if I find myself at the pearly gates, I'm going to deal with the reality that I'm currently experiencing. I might stand there and go, I just don't believe this. How could this, pinch me and all this, I'm going to want independent verification, but absent the possibility of getting that, I'm going to accept the reality that I'm experiencing.
Oh, I definitely, okay, can I follow up?
Sure.
Real quick. Okay.
I said sure, Ezra's in charge.
So it's interesting, when you say that possibility has to be demonstrated, how would you demonstrate the possibility that God doesn't exist?
I don't know. My position is that the actual proposition is probably unfalsifiable, which is why I have a problem with it.
But so does that mean that the belief that God does not exist, does that mean that's illicit in some way because it can't be demonstrated that it's even possible that God doesn't exist?
So it depends on whether or not what you mean. So it depends on whether you're talking about belief or knowledge or certainty. So I think it's reasonable. You can make a case that it's reasonable to believe that this is most likely not true, even though you can't.
Even though you can't
calculate the probability.
But
yes.
Even though you can't demonstrate its possibility, you are saying you can be rational and you can have evidence and you can be justified in believing God does not exist, even though you can't demonstrate it's possible that God doesn't exist.
Well, so it's not about whether or not it's possible for God not to exist.
Well, because I've heard you say that you can't believe.
Because possible that you're kind of shifting what I would consider to be the burden of proof. It's not up to people to demonstrate that it's possible for God to not exist. It's up to people to demonstrate that it's possible for God to exist.
Right, that's what I'm questioning, because you say that you should only accept that, if someone wants to explain something by supernatural means, you have to demonstrate that it's possible that God exists. What I'm saying is, logically, this can be reversed. These are two different positions. I'm not talking about agnosticism. I'm talking about positive atheism, the claim that God doesn't exist.
Yes.
And in order to say in order to try to, again, from what I understand is
I only defend the positive claim that God doesn't exist in the sense of I believe that this is the most reasonable conclusion based on the information that I have available. It is not a claim of absolute certainty. I'm not making a claim to truth. If I looked at the world and saw that for millennia people have invented gods and religions, and to me, there's no reason to pick one over another. And from the standpoint of any one of them, all of the rest of them are wrong. They can't all be right, but I don't see any reason why they can't all be wrong. That's it. That's it.
Question for Matt?
Yeah, you've hit part of this question already. Just
Well,
now.
good.
If you absolutely believe logic or the laws of logic are real, independent of space, time,
So you're talking about identity, non-contradiction, excluded middle, that
sure,
thing?
yes.
Sure.
Or by however you define them, who cares? Outside, if you think they're real outside of space, time, matter, multiple universes, our minds, whatever, why do you believe that? How do you know? Can you know other things that way, or know things purely on the basis of
So,
science?
yeah, I pointed this out. This isn't a position of absolute certainty. It's a presupposition that seems to be a necessity. I don't know that Blake would probably have better language to put to this, but in any attempt to demonstrate that they weren't true would require them to be true. So there's a contradiction there. But that becomes circular, because the only reason there's a problem with the contradiction is because the law of non-contradiction. And so much like the problem of hard solipsism, I don't see any solution to it, but I'm going to live my life as if I'm not the only mind, because I think it's kind of arrogant to presume that you are the only mind. I've written every great song you've ever heard. It's all me. Similarly, I have no solution to how we can verify the logical absolutes. All I know is that they appear to consistently work, and in every hypothetical scenario, even in the absence of anything, they still appear to hold, at least in thought experiments. I don't know any way, and I don't think that they can be verified outside of that, which is why I consider them a presupposition, and I don't claim absolute certainty anymore. Used to.
Interestingly, if God exists, then solipsism is false. So if you can prove God exists, then you're out of the solipsism
If
problem.
God exists, I'm going to hell. And yet, we both said
Sorry, and by the-
something, and
by the way-
neither of us have demonstrated the truth of the proposition.
We should probably tell people what solipsism is, because they're probably hearing that and they're like, what the heck?
Yeah, solipsism is this idea that there's a number of different, either you're the only mind that exists, or you're brain of out, or the matrix, or these other sorts of thoughts experiments that relate to solipsism. It's mind-boggling and fun for some of us.
And solipsism in its purest form, in the form that I said that would be false, is this idea that you're the only mind that exists and there's nothing outside of your brain. Everything is a figment of your imagination. And so obviously if God exists...
Which means I really dislike myself, because I keep giving, like Ray Comfort and Cy to debate instead of these guys, which is much better.
Question for Blake.
Sorry.
Blake, Matt, thank you both, and BBC.
Thank you.
Really appreciate you putting this on. It's been a lot of fun. I apologize in advance. I only have one question, but coming full circle.
Well played.
As with the first, I'm going to read for the sake of brevity, but as with the first question, I'd like to ask Blake, assuming polytheism, which two or more gods would you have there be? What is their nature and why?
Which two or more gods? I'm just going to be honest, when I haven't thought about an issue, that seems like something I'd have to sit down and think about.
I feel the same was true for Matt. It was kind of an interesting question. I think it was a great question, but so I was posing the same to you, but just in a
I don't
different
have an
vein.
answer off the top of my head. It is a good question.
Right.
It's one of those things that I'd want to sit down and think about for a while.
Fair enough.
I'm not going to add anything. I've talked a lot.
Last question online for Blake by David. Blake asserted that the spontaneous creation of life is infinitesimally small, but if the universe is subjectively or actually infinite, doesn't an infinitesimally small chance become statistical certainty?
I didn't understand the question.
I didn't either, and I
Sorry, David, you stumped us.
yeah.
I guess so.
Every
You
one
win,
of us.
David. Question for Matt.
Hi, Matt. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
We've talked a lot about evidence tonight. I've watched a lot of your debates and talks, and I know you've talked about that, and you've talked about hard solipsism, and there's no we in hard solipsism, right? Yeah. The question I had, though, seriously, for evidence is, you brought up the courtroom analogy early on in your presentation. In the court analogy, you have the idea that there is an overarching set of rules, whether it's established by federal courts or state courts or local jurisdictions. In the case of putting God in the dock or God in the witness stand or God on trial, how does the skeptic, or how is it established? What is the courtroom criteria for the admission of acceptable evidence in this? Who's judging what gets into the courtroom off the bat?
So I'd say I don't know that I would have any standards about what is acceptable evidence. I think you should consider everything. It's about what evidence is sufficient. So if 100 people come and tell me about a UFO they saw, I mean, that's all anecdotal. It's fundamentally no different from one person saying it, except that you have multiple witnesses, which is really interesting and seems unlikely that they would have this same story. And yet that is not on its own, to me, sufficient to believe it. And I think that this is the case for almost everybody. For example, there are people you can go talk to right now who will tell you their alien abduction story, lots of them. And they share common themes and common claims and common alien designs, and they seem to be wholly consistent accounts. And it's not outside it's nothing supernatural about aliens visiting. It's a big universe. It perhaps might not be surprising at all by things like the Blake equation that there were aliens. Whether or not they get here, well, who knows? And yet I don't believe them. And yet somehow, when we talk about God claims, and I'm not accusing Blake of this because he didn't, but quite often we're expected to take these masses of claims as more believable simply because they're older. You know, the idea's been around for a long time. So you take these anecdotal accounts of aliens and wait 2,000 years to where you no longer know who made these accounts. You can't investigate. You can't question them. And for some reason, it seems more believable to perhaps a lot of people than the alien claims which are here now.
So for you, just to follow up, so for you, the initial question, the establishment of evidential criteria is kind of an open book.
Well, it depends on the nature of the claim. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence is Sagan's thing. If you tell me you have a pet dog, I'm probably going to believe you. I'm going to take you at your word because it's common for people to have a dog. I could be wrong. There's no risk to me being wrong. I don't have to change my entire view and understanding of the world to accept that you have a dog. But to borrow more from Sagan, if you tell me you have a pet invisible dragon in your garage, well, now all of a sudden it's a different nature claim and it requires more evidence than just your say-so for me to be reasonably justified in accepting it. I think all of us would kind of say those.
Wouldn't you just need simple evidence to show that I just saw a sponge wearing pants on the bottom of the seafloor? I could just show you a simple evidence that I was watching TV, right?
Yeah.
It's not extraordinary in that sense. If I make this weird claim that I saw a sponge wearing pants, it seems extraordinary. But the evidence to show you that I was true is not extraordinary.
Yeah, and when theists come to me and tell me that they experience God by watching TV, then okay, now I'll accept that claim.
Right.
But yeah.
Well, thank you.
I just had, I guess, two small points. One in the case of aliens is I just wanted to say this is very well accounted for in what the equation that I showed you earlier. The hypothesis that aliens visit is going to have an extremely low prior probability because you've got to take into account the unlikelihood that aliens exist, the unlikelihood that they would be able to reach the planet Earth. There are all sorts of problems there. The unlikelihood that they, of all things, would do exactly this. The probability ends up being very small. So I think that's accounted for. And I wanted to say something about the courtroom illustration since it came up and now I get to talk about it a bit.
Sure.
I don't think that that's the best way to think about whether something is true or not. Because,
yeah, I know you don't.
Well, I mean, here's the thing. You set it up like, God is guilty of not existing, or how did you put it?
Not guilty of the charge of existing.
Right. And so what's interesting to me about this situation is, like, of all the scenarios that you could have analogized our truth quest to, you analogized it in this case where the jurors will do something deliberately irrational for prudential reasons. And the prudential reason in this case is we don't want to charge an innocent man and punish an innocent man. And so we'll actually let a man that we rationally believe is guilty, we're going to let him off the hook for prudential reasons. And so I thought it was interesting that you picked that.
For the sake of this, let's just say I'm talking about the hypothetical purely rational jury.
You're saying that, here's the thing is you're talking.
It's not a response to my argument to condemn things that happen in a courtroom.
But then if we wouldn't have the innocent until proven guilty, or how did you put, or yeah, it wouldn't be
Yes,
innocent.
you still would.
No, because if they're perfectly rational, then, oh no, wait, hold on. If they're perfectly rational, okay, sorry,
We'll do this one later too.
I'm gonna hold that down until I figure
We'll do this later too.
Yeah.
Question for Blake.
My question has to do, it's three objections that I have to the whole fine-tuning of the universe. I have three complaints with the fine-tuning of the cosmos. The first one is, first of all, you kind of assume that there could be other universes with other sets of rules. And as far as I know, nobody's found God's iPad with the slider controls. The second problem is things that are exceedingly rare sometimes do happen. There's an article by Robbie Gonzalez on Ion 9 that talks about how unfathomable it is that any one of us exist, talking about the odds of over 120,000 generations is the right egg getting with the right semen. And he stated that the odds of any one of us existing are 1 in 10 to the 2,685,000th. So we are extremely, every one of us has beat
very improbable.
And it's all through naturalistic means. The final problem of it is talking about odds after the fact make no sense at all. You could say, I mean, looking at Robbie's statistics, the odds of me existing are 1 in 2,685,000. But the odds that I actually do exist after the fact are 1 in 1 because I do exist.
Yeah. So just so you're aware, this has applications to intelligent design. That type of objection will come up in response to someone who's raising a particular type of intelligent design argument that I'm not raising. I'm raising an improbability argument, and if someone could demonstrate that your very precise existence, not just humanity, but your very, very precise existence was only predicted on theism and yet not atheism, if it was only predicted on theism, then it would be phenomenal evidence for theism. But theism does not predict that you very specifically, with your exact molecular makeup and so forth exists, which is why all of the extra information added in virtue of your very specific and probable existence does not count in favor of theism. It only counts in favor of theism to the degree that you're a mind that has consciousness and is ultimately participating in a moral arena. And sorry, I mean, I apologize, I forgot the rest of your questions. I don't know if you want to come up and ask them again or something.
They all went to the one point on the probability. Okay. And this is something we should write down for later, because I'd really like to know how and why theism specifically predicts anything. Because I'm not convinced that that's true, but that's kind of big.
Well, you got to go to the intuition that you were referring to earlier. That look, if God exists, we wouldn't expect him, if he's a good God, to hide from us, right? And so you're having it's not a prediction directly, because predictions are absolute in a sense, but it's a graded version of a prediction. You would say it's less likely, if God existed, it's less likely that we would not see him around the world. It's less likely that there would be this kind of suffering. And so you want to say that in virtue of this, these pieces of data are more likely on atheism than on theism, and so that means they're evidence for atheism.
Yeah, I think, and we can talk about this another time, because I think there's something being added to theism here, because I could take the classical God, the classical theism model, and say that I could envision that it doesn't predict any of the things that we actually see, that, put yourself in God's shoes, you're there, why would I why would I do anything? Actually, the book that I'm writing is, If I Were God. And so I've been thinking about this, but we'll save it for another time. Hey, you have one for me.
Yes, I do.
Oh, wait,
well,
Ezra might have it online.
Hang on. David's watching online, and he resubmitted his question.
Oh, well.
So we're going to try again.
Okay.
If something has a very small chance, but you try it infinite times, isn't it a statistical certainty that it will eventually happen?
Well, okay, so so let's say if you roll a dice, a number of times, you're bound to get a 6, right? But here's the thing: is you're not bound to necessarily get a 7. So it's not just numbers that count. You have to have the right kind of number. So you can have an infinite multiverse, and yet none of those could be the kind of universe that's life permitting. My objection, though, to the multiverse was all the things that I mentioned in my opening statement. So even if you have an infinite multiverse, you run into various problems, and the models that make use of an infinite multiverse have these mechanism issues that, all the stuff that I mentioned in my opening statement, I won't recap it.
Sorry for the beeps.
We're going to deal with the question of creation, but it's a corollary question instead of, is biblical creation correct? If we look at biblical creation, we typically see this word day, which actually is the Hebrew word yom, which could mean era or epoch or some indefinite period of time. Now, if you were to try to explain in about 20 sentences how the cosmos was created, you would find the biblical account, if you simply substitute the word epoch, to be substantially correct. You only have about 20 sentences to explain it. There was, in the first stage, the separation of light from matter. The creation of energy occurred from a Big Bang. Scientists have proved this. We then saw the separation of the atmosphere of the Earth from the surface below. You know, scientists did not know this could happen until late in the 20th century when we sent probes to Jupiter and discovered it has no defined surface. Okay? But the Bible talks about this separation of surface from the waters above from the waters below. The Bible then talks about that the land appeared out of the water. And scientists know that if we totally flattened all the land, the earth would be covered by water. And then plant life developed first, and then animal life followed it. And then animal life out of the waters came after that, and the last major species to be created was man. Now, Moses wrote this in the 13th or 14th century BC. He had no scientific instruments. He had no special scientific knowledge. How did Moses get the correct order of creation right unless it was with divine revelation?
Well, first of all,
no other religion other than saying the cosmos began as a void, which, by the way, Hindus, Taoists, they all agree. That was the beginning, and that there was a spark of energy that began the process. So in that regard, God did make a universal revelation all across the world at the same time. But how did Moses, who was not a scientific man, remarkably know things over 3,000 years ago, which scientists did not know until less than 50 years ago?
Sure. So first of all, he didn't actually get the order right. Second of all, it may not have been Moses. There might not have existed a Moses. Third of all, the fact that somebody wrote something down doesn't mean that they knew what you interpret it to mean after the fact. I'd point you to talkorigins.org. There's an index to creationist claims where the specific claim that the order of creation in Genesis is correct is thoroughly debunked, showing that the order is very different. But your argument, how did Moses know this other than divine, is in fact an argument from ignorance fallacy. Even if we don't know how Moses knew, that doesn't mean you're justified in leaping to the divine. That is a fallacy.
We're going to the probability that an event could happen. For example, if you were known to be a card shark, then you could deal out 13 spades.
Yeah.
I'm not, and I can't do that. And
you can't deal 13 spades? It's impossible for you to do it?
No, I can. The chances are 1 in several millions. I'm a bridge player, by the way. Okay, so I know no odds. I play cards all the time.
Sure.
That can happen. And it does happen, in fact. But on the other hand, if I was adept at rigging the deck, I could make it happen far more often. Then we deal with the probability.
And if you were God, you could make it happen every time. So what's the point?
If you're capable of fixing a deck, then we say the weight of the evidence is you fix the deck to deal 13 spades.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Sure.
Roughly how old do you think the Earth is?
Earth is about 4.5 billion years, based upon radiometric dating.
So you're willing to accept the scientific findings, and the order that science finds it in, you're okay with?
From an Earth-born observer, yes.
Okay. So the order of the creation account in Genesis does not match the order. The fact that you can go in and read in the beginning and interpret these things so that they are consistent. The Bible did not inform us of the scientific facts, and if it had gotten the order exactly correct, we would not be justified in believing that that was the order until we had verified it empirically, scientifically. This is why when the Bible, people claim that, oh, the Bible has all sorts of scientific information, they claim the same thing about the Quran. None of that information is of any use as a reasonable explanation until sometimes it's confirmed by scientific investigation.
Actually, I've read the Quran 7 times cover to cover, and it's not even close to the biblical account.
Well, maybe you should read the Bible again, because it's not close either. Talkorigins.org.
As stated, from an Earth-born observer, until the carbon dioxide clouds disappeared, you could not see any celestial object. And that would have required conversion by plant life.
Do you have a time machine, sir?
Being respectful of the time we have here, let's move to closing statements.
Oh, who's first?
You.
Oh, mercy. How long do I have?
How long's your closing statement?
I'll just keep it short. Thanks, everybody. Even the gentleman, I realize I was a bit antagonistic, is because if you go to like some of the creationist sites, there's like a list of arguments that they think creationists shouldn't use, and that's one of them. And it always surprises me when it comes up that, you know, the order is right. But it was fallacious. I don't believe that a God exists. I very rarely defend the idea that God in fact does not exist, or that it is reasonable to believe that God in fact does not exist. To the extent that I do this, it's based on the things that I mentioned. That, you know, hey, we know people have invented gods. Even, you know, Blake and the other Christians, they have their God and they think the other ones in fact don't exist, and that this is reasonable. There is a difference in why they think theirs is reasonable versus mine. They think theirs is reasonable because they've found the one true God. And I'm willing to accept all of their claims that none of them have found the one true God, because it doesn't seem to be something that's been demonstrated. There's this problem of being able to confirm the supernatural. When we talk about something like Jesus, you know, and the resurrection and all of the things about his existence, to the extent that maybe he existed, maybe he didn't. I'm not getting into the mythicist ideas, because I don't see any reason to hang my hat there. I could concede that Jesus existed. That doesn't mean we have a good record of what he actually did or said and no way to investigate it. But I could also concede that we have a good record of what he said, even without the, you know, I could concede that point. And that doesn't mean that we necessarily know what he did. And even if you concede that he know what he did, that doesn't mean that you have an explanation for how he did it. The presentation of an effect does not in and of itself confirm a cause. This is the process of science to confirm reasonably the causes for these things. How did Moses write this stuff down if not for divine intervention? I don't know. How did you rule out Moses having a time machine, or it being coincidence, or someone who knew more than him, or any number of other explanations? You have to show a pathway from what you're trying to explain to your proposed explanation. You can't just say, how else could it have happened? All the arguments in the world, modal or otherwise, don't seem to be able to confirm this on their own. This isn't a declaration that gods don't exist. It's not even a declaration that Blake's arguments are wrong. It's the position of, I don't accept them. I don't see that there's good reason for this. And quite frankly, if there were a God, why hasn't he cleared this stuff up already? The divine hiddenness problem, I think, is a real big deal. And there are plenty of theologians who accept that this is a real big deal, and they've come up with explanations. I'd love to have an entire conversation about that sometime. I wasn't a humanist when I was a Christian. I wasn't a humanist when I first found my way out, but I'm a humanist now. I do these sorts of things. I used to joke that I did it as penance for all the people that I tried to lead to Jesus. Now I want to drag them away. But that's not it at all. I care about what people believe because our beliefs inform our actions, and our actions have consequences for ourselves and others. For me, the only thing you need for a moral arena is human beings interacting with each other, irrespective of how they got there. If God were to vanish from the world, we would still have problems. We would still have this sense of fairness, this desire to thrive and survive, and we'd have to come up with solutions to it. If there is a God, that situation doesn't really change. Laws are valuable to the extent that they're enforced. If you tell me that something's against the law but nobody's going to enforce it, what difference does it make? Smoking weed's against the law in Texas. I was at McKinney Falls last night. Somebody's swimming around with 100 people around him, toking right up. Now, I'm in favor of legalization, but right now it's illegal. But if they're not going to enforce it, is it? What does it mean to say it's illegal? And to talk about some sort of moral guide where morality is going to be enforced after you're dead does me no good now. We're on our own. If there's an afterlife, it's a bonus, no matter what it is. And any moral being, in my mind, that wants to punish someone for being intellectually honest and being a humane, decent person who cares about the human condition, who cares about the one and only life that we know we're going to exist, who wants to punish that individual merely because they didn't genuflect or believe or devote their life to an idea that they honestly could not find a reason to believe, is a moral monster. I asked Blake about the drowning of the babies. Because even if you're the one with purview over life and death, don't you have some obligation to your creation to not be a monster about it? If there's a God that you can only reasonably discover, which may or may not be the case, Blake and I disagree on this, after you're dead, okay. But that's an admission that our position is now equivalent. Whether this God excuses this action or this failure of ours or not. If you tell me I'm inheriting something later, I don't know that that's true. What if you spend your first 18 years with the expectation that you're going to inherit $1 million on your 18th birthday? If it's true, okay, then all the bad decisions that you've made may work out. If it's not, then you've made a huge mistake. Belief in anything, a God, not a God, Republicans, Democrats, Greens, social, whatever political party, these things carry weight. They have consequences on our action, and I think it's important that we use the best methods possible to determine whether or not we're correct. Right now, I don't see any good reason to believe that a God exists. I think there may be some reasonable arguments that gods don't exist. But the point is, if you're going to claim that God exists and that this is reasonable, you've got to come with more than probability, more than this model, which was constructed to explain something, seems to explain it. You dealt me these cards, it's most likely that you're cheating, and therefore I'm going to believe that you're cheating. It may, in fact, be reasonable given the information that you have, but what about the information you don't have? Not to be overly offensive, because I've been there, and I will hopefully continue to learn more, and I genuinely like Blake and John and a number of other people I've defended, or debated, and I've defended them. But I think there's an element of the Dunning-Kruger effect here, where you're making proclamations about what is likely in the absence of sufficient knowledge to even know what you don't know. And I kind of gave that up, so I don't believe a God exists. Thanks.
Matt Dillahunty. Blake, closing statement.
First, I just want to say thanks again to all of you for coming out, and once again, thanks to you, Matt. I really enjoyed that, and I think you've given us a lot to think about, so I really appreciate that. I'm going to resist the urge to respond to just point by point everything you said there. That'd be pretty cheap.
We'll never go home.
I know, right? But I know we both have a lot more to say about things that came up here, and time just flies. It seems to me that the question of God's existence is not just a pointless intellectual exercise. I think it can have very real consequences in your life. And as I mentioned before, Matt and I were originally going to be talking about the resurrection, but we were thinking about it. It ended up being that we've got like 3 events now this year that ended up being on the resurrection, and so that's why we decided to go ahead and move to talk about God's existence. But the BBC is very much about Jesus' resurrection, because at the end of the day, we're about the gospel, and I think that that's the best way to get you to the gospel. A lot of people think that you have to believe in biblical inerrancy in order to be a Christian, and I don't think that that's the right way to go about things. I think the way you do it is you first want to ask yourself, look, is there a good reason to think that God exists? And if so, make sure you have reasons to think that Jesus existed as well, and then you want to ask yourself, does Jesus stand out like one chosen by God? And I think that there are several reasons to think that Jesus does. I've got a whole section on this written on beliefmap.org, but Jesus stands out even from a secular perspective in virtue of how influential he is on history, what he means for people's lives. There's more architecture built in the name of Jesus, more songs, more literature written, more people think about him than any other individual. Jesus really stands out in history, and if I had time, I'd go into these other things that I think makes Jesus stand out like a representative of God would. I think Jesus fulfills prophecy. I think that Jesus, one of the most interesting and underrated arguments, I think, in apologetics is the way that Jesus is foreshadowed in the Old Testament. So there's a lot to say there. I think that Jesus really stands out. But then something else comes along, and that is the historical case for Jesus' resurrection, which is what we love to talk about at the BBC. I think that evidence is really powerful and independent of all of these other details. The reason so many people follow Jesus and find Jesus to be special and all this stuff that I just got done talking about isn't because of the evidence for the resurrection. It's independent. And yet when we look at this figure who just so happens to be the most important seeming figure in history, we also find another coincidence. And it's this coincidence that we have this phenomenally powerful case for Jesus' resurrection. And in broad strokes, the idea is that virtually every non-Christian scholar will grant that the apostles genuinely believed Jesus appeared to them. And a number of naturalistic explanations, the swoon theory that Jesus didn't really die on the cross, or that the apostles hallucinated, which is the most popular naturalistic theory right now, or that just the various naturalistic explanations that are out there all seem to run into really big problems. And so you have individuals like Antony Flew, who's an Oxford University professor who passed away recently, but he was long been the most prominent atheist, and he said, look, the evidence for Jesus' resurrection is different than every other miracle, both in terms of quality and quantity. And Jeff Lauder, probably one of the atheists who I respect more than anyone, said something very similar. People are very surprised when they investigate this and how difficult it is to explain the apostles' experience. And on the basis of that, if we have reason to think that Jesus really did rise from the dead, then you got to take far more seriously Jesus' claims about salvation and where we're standing in front of God as people who are in the moral wrong before a perfectly just and righteous God, and that has consequences. And at the same time, I want to say, in the midst of God's justice, there's sort of a pathway that's been carved in God's love. So God's perfectly just and perfectly love, and sort of that pathway, I want to say, is Jesus Christ. There's a way to avert God's justice and be saved. That's the whole message, and the way I want to suggest that you could get there that makes it more plausible than ever is asking, does God exist first? Then you want to ask, does Jesus stand out like a real as an individual who's a chosen representative of God? Does he stand out like that? And if he does, then ask yourself, what about this evidence for the resurrection? Because now you can take it more seriously than ever, I think. And then that, if you end up believing that Jesus rose from the dead, then it's a short step to believing in the gospel. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you all.
I'm a little down in the dump. Easy down, harder up. But take it with a grain of salt. 'Cause the Lord knows